My name is Claire Sutton. I am 34 years old, and I work as a freelance medical biller. Exactly 2 hours after we lowered my parents into the ground, my older brother stood on the porch of our family home and kicked my 8-year-old daughter's belongings into the freezing rain. He looked down at me, a woman who had paused her entire life to provide round-the-clock hospice care for our dying parents, and told me I owned nothing. He told me to enjoy the motel. He thought locking me out would secure his multi-million-dollar inheritance. He thought I was just the quiet, invisible sister he could easily crush. But he had no idea that as I knelt in the mud to pick up my crying daughter's soaked stuffed bear, I was about to find something hidden inside it. A secret that was going to completely destroy his perfect life. The rain in Pennsylvania that afternoon did not fall. It crashed. It was a bitter, unrelenting downpour that soaked right through my cheap black wool coat the second I stepped out of my 10-year-old sedan. My daughter Lily sat in the back seat, her tiny hands clutching her seatbelt. She was exhausted, shivering, and confused. We had just come from the cemetery. We had just buried my father and my mother Thomas and Diane Sutton in a joint plot. They died within 3 weeks of each other. For the past 2 years, that beautiful, sprawling colonial house in the Philadelphia suburbs had not been a home to me. It had been a hospital ward. I had moved back into my childhood bedroom with Lily to become their full-time caretaker. I paused my career. I spent my days fighting with insurance companies, cross-referencing medical billing codes, appealing Medicare denials, measuring out liquid morphine, and changing adult diapers. I did it because they were my parents. I did it because family shows up when things get dark. But apparently family only shows up when there is a camera around or a check to be cashed. I unbuckled Lily, lifted her into my arms to keep her shoes out of the puddles, and carried her up the slate walkway. I noticed my older brother Bradley's car parked in the prime spot in the driveway. It was a brand new jet black leased BMW. Bradley worked in corporate sales. He was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong. While I was calculating milligrams of pain medication and sleeping in a hard plastic chair next to my mother's hospital bed, Bradley was closing deals and sending text messages that said he was super busy this quarter. He visited exactly twice in 2 years. Both times he stayed for 20 minutes, took a sad-looking selfie with our father for his social media, and left before I could even ask him to help me turn Dad over to prevent bed sores. I reached the massive oak front door and pulled my keys from my purse. My hands were freezing. I slid the familiar brass key into the deadbolt. It did not turn. I pushed it in harder, thinking the cold metal was just sticking. It refused to catch. I jiggled the handle, locked. I knocked hard on the heavy wood, assuming someone had thrown the interior chain. The door swung open, but it was not a welcoming gesture. Bradley stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my entire car. His wife Jessica stood right behind him. She wore a pristine black designer dress completely untouched by the rain. Her makeup was flawless. She held a glass of expensive red wine in her hand, wine I had actually purchased for my mother's birthday months ago. They looked like they were hosting a corporate cocktail party, not returning from a double funeral. I looked at them confused and shivering. "The key is sticking," I said, wiping wet hair out of my eyes. "Can you let us in? Lily is freezing." Bradley did not move an inch. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked down his nose at me. "The key isn't sticking, Claire. I changed the locks this morning while you were at the viewing." I stared at him. The words did not make sense. My brain, exhausted from weeks of grief and 2 solid years of sleep deprivation, could not process the sentence. "You changed the locks, Bradley. What are you talking about? All of our things are inside. Lily's school clothes are inside. My work computer is inside." Bradley stepped aside just enough for me to see the foyer. Sitting on the hardwood floor right where my mother used to keep her antique vase were 2 large black plastic garbage bags. "I packed for you," Bradley said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You do not live here anymore." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I put Lily down on the covered part of the porch and gripped her hand tightly. She pressed her face into my wet coat. "Bradley, I have lived here for 2 years. I took care of Mom and Dad. I was the one who held Mom's hand when she took her last breath while you were ignoring my phone calls. You cannot just lock me out." Jessica took a sip of her wine and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, please, Claire. Do not play the martyr. You lived here rent-free because you could not afford your own place. You were freeloading off your parents. Bradley and I are just cleaning up the mess." I felt a flash of pure heat rush through my freezing body. Freeloading, I saved them over $200,000 in private nursing care. I kept my medical billing clients on a part-time basis, working until 3 in the morning just so I could afford groceries for this house. I paid for the groceries because Bradley stopped contributing a dime a year ago. Bradley scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "I did not need to contribute. I am the successful one. I am the one carrying the Sutton name into the corporate world. Dad and Mom always knew the house would go to me. It is the family legacy. It is not a halfway house for a struggling single mother. He stepped forward, filling the doorway using his physical size to intimidate me. Probate is a formality. I am the executor. I am the heir. I already have a cash buyer lined up for this property. I need you and your kid out so I can stage the rooms. The buyer is coming through tomorrow. You have a buyer, I yelled over the sound of the crashing rain. They have not even been dead a month. We just buried them today. You cannot sell this house without a formal will reading. Bradley smiled. It was a cold, calculated, arrogant smile. Watch me. I have power of attorney. I have the legal contacts. I have creditors waiting to be paid for my new business ventures. And I have zero patience for your drama. He turned around, grabbed the 2 heavy black garbage bags by their plastic ties and dragged them onto the porch. Here is your severance package, he sneered. Then he lifted his expensive leather shoe and kicked the bags down the porch steps. They tumbled heavily down the wet slate. One of the bags caught on a sharp stone edge and ripped wide open. My modest clothes, my medical billing certification manuals, and Lily's pajamas spilled out into the freezing mud. Lily screamed and buried her face in my leg. I dropped to my knees in the rain, desperately trying to shove our belongings back into the torn plastic. The rain was soaking through my clothes. My hands were covered in mud and freezing water. I looked up at my brother. The brother I used to play tag with. The brother our parents had practically worshipped. How can you do this? I asked, my voice cracking. Where are we supposed to go? Bradley looked down at me with absolute disgust. The house is mine. You own nothing. Enjoy the motel. He stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door shut. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a heavy metallic thud. I was left kneeling in the mud, the rain washing over me, holding my sobbing 8-year-old daughter. I felt completely broken. I felt like the invisible, useless sister he had always claimed I was. I reached into the torn garbage bag to pull out Lily's favorite possession so it would not get ruined. It was a worn, brown stuffed bear my mother had given her last Christmas. The bear was completely soaked heavy with dirty rainwater. I picked it up to brush the mud off its face. As I squeezed the water out of its fabric belly, my fingers caught on something strange. I stopped crying. I squeezed the bear again. Deep inside the stuffing, right in the center of the toy, I felt a hard, flat, rectangular object. It was deliberately sewn into the seam. I wiped my wet face, looking from the locked door of my childhood home down to the stuffed bear in my muddy hands. Bradley thought he had won. He thought he had thrown out the trash, but he had no idea he had just thrown out the one thing that was going to tear his entire world apart. The rain battered the windshield of my 10-year-old sedan as I drove us away from the only home I had ever known. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. In the rearview mirror, I could see my 8-year-old daughter Lily shivering in her booster seat. Her damp hair was plastered to her pale cheeks. She was clutching that muddy, soaked stuffed bear tightly to her chest, staring out the window at the blurred streetlights with eyes completely hollowed out by confusion. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had no plan. I had packed no bags. My brother Bradley had literally thrown us out into a freezing storm exactly 2 hours after we buried our parents. I had to get my daughter warm. I drove slowly down the local Pennsylvania highway until the flickering neon sign of the Starlight Motel cut through the unrelenting downpour. It was the kind of cheap $50 a night roadside place you only stop at when you have absolutely no other choice. The parking lot was full of deep puddles and rusted cars. I pulled up to the main office, instructing Lily to stay locked inside the car with the heater running. Inside the office, the air smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine cleaner. I paid for one night using a crumpled $50 bill I found stuffed in the bottom lining of my purse. It was the absolute last of my physical cash. The desk clerk handed me a heavy metal key attached to a scratched plastic diamond. Room 112. I drove around to the back of the peeling stucco building parked right in front of our door and hurried Lily inside. The room was exactly what you would expect from a roadside motel. It had peeling floral wallpaper, a sagging double bed covered in a thin brown bedspread, and a bathroom fixture that dripped a steady rhythm into a heavily stained tub. But it was dry, and the wall radiator blasted a wave of harsh heat into the freezing air. I stripped off Lily's wet clothes, wrapped her in the cleanest-looking towel I could find, and tucked her firmly under the covers. She looked up at me with wide, terrified brown eyes. She asked me if Uncle Bradley hated us. She asked me why we could not go back to Grandma and Grandpa's house. I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat, forcing a brave smile I absolutely did not feel. I told her we were just having a spontaneous adventure. I told her everything was going to be perfectly fine, but then her stomach let out a loud, hollow rumble. Neither of us had eaten a single thing since the meager breakfast before the funeral service. Right next door to the motel lot was a brightly lit 24-hour diner. I told Lily we were going to get the biggest plate of grilled cheese and fries they had. I grabbed my purse, wrapped my own damp wool coat back around my shoulders, and carried her through the rain to the diner. The diner smelled intensely of frying grease and burnt coffee. We sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back. I ordered Lily her food and a hot chocolate to warm her up. For myself, I just ordered a black coffee. I watched her eat with an appetite that broke my heart. She was so innocent, completely unaware of the monstrous greed her uncle had just displayed on our front porch. When the waitress finally dropped the green paper bill on our table, it came to $14.50. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my primary debit card. This card was connected to the joint caretaking account I shared with my late mother. For 2 solid years, this specific account was used to manage household expenses, buy groceries, and cover the expensive out-of-pocket medical supplies that hospice simply did not provide. There was over $8,000 in that account just yesterday morning. It was a financial cushion my parents insisted I maintain for emergencies exactly like this one. I handed the card to the waitress with a tired smile. She swiped it at the register near the counter. I watched her frown deeply. She tried wiping the magnetic strip and swiping it again. Then she walked back over to our booth holding the plastic card awkwardly between 2 fingers. She told me it was declined. I blinked, completely confused. I told her that was impossible. I asked her to please run it one more time as a credit transaction instead of debit. She sighed, walked back to the machine, and punched the buttons. A minute later, she returned, shaking her head. Declined again. The word echoed in my ears, triggering a cold sweat down my neck. The waitress looked at my wet clothes, looked at Lily happily eating her fries, and her expression softened with quiet pity. I frantically dug through the very bottom of my purse, turning it inside out. I managed to find exactly $4 in quarters and dimes and a single crumpled $10 bill hidden in a zippered side pocket. I paid the bill, leaving a pile of silver coins as a tip, and practically ran back to the motel room with Lily holding my hand. The panic was setting in deep now, taking root in my chest. I locked the motel door, turned on the television to distract Lily with loud cartoons, and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed the 24-hour automated customer service number for my bank. I punched in my account number and my PIN with trembling fingers. The automated voice informed me that my available balance was 0. Furthermore, the account status was listed as frozen. I pressed 0 repeatedly until I finally got a live human being on the line. A representative answered. I gave her my name, my social security number, and my mother's information, slipping into the firm professional tone I use daily as a medical biller fighting stubborn insurance companies. I explained that I was a joint account holder, that my card had just been declined, and I demanded to know why my account was frozen. The representative placed me on a brief hold. The terrible tinny hold music grated against my frayed nerves. When she came back, her voice was completely professional and utterly devastating. She informed me that earlier that very afternoon, a Mr. Bradley Sutton had visited a local branch in person. He presented a signed, notarized power of attorney document, along with an emergency executor mandate claiming that my mother's funds needed to be immediately secured for probate. He effectively locked the account, freezing all assets and revoking my access entirely. I sat heavily on the edge of that sagging motel bed, struggling to pull air into my lungs. Bradley had used a forged power of attorney. My mother would never have signed such a document giving him control. She knew he had not visited in 2 years. She knew he only cared about his corporate image and his expensive leased cars. Bradley had somehow manufactured a legal document, walked into the bank while I was standing at our parents' gravesite crying, and systematically stripped me of every single penny I had to my name. I was 34 years old, holding my 8-year-old daughter in a cheap motel, and I was entirely penniless. He had completely cornered me. He knew I had paused my freelance medical billing career to provide round-the-clock care for our parents. He knew I had no other immediate income stream. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me starving. He wanted me so financially broken that I would not have the resources to hire a lawyer and fight him for the house. I looked over at the bed. Lily had fallen asleep, her chest rising and falling softly. The television cast a pale blue light across the dingy room. Lying next to her on the pillow was that ruined stuffed bear. The mud had dried into an ugly brown crust on its fur. I picked it up gently, not wanting to wake her. The bear felt strange. As my fingers brushed against its stomach, I felt it again. That stiff, hard, rectangular shape completely hidden beneath the synthetic stuffing. A strange prickle of intuition ran down my spine. My mother had given this bear to Lily last Christmas. But just 3 days before the fatal car crash that took both my parents' lives, my mother had asked to borrow the bear to mend a small tear in its back. I remembered watching her sit in her rocking chair, needle and thread in hand, making careful, deliberate stitches. I walked into the tiny, brightly lit motel bathroom and closed the door so the noise would not disturb Lily. I searched the bathroom counter and found a small, cheap plastic sewing kit provided by the motel in a little cardboard box. I took out the tiny pair of folding scissors. My hands were shaking so severely I could barely grip the tiny metal handles. I carefully snipped the thread along the back seam of the bear. I pulled the wet fabric apart and reached my fingers deep into the cotton stuffing. My fingers brushed against a stiff plastic pouch. I pulled it out. It was a heavy-duty clear plastic sleeve. Inside the sleeve was a small polished brass key with a serial number stamped into the metal. Wrapped around the key was a piece of heavy cream stationery folded neatly into a tight square. I recognized the stationery immediately. It was my mother's personal writing paper. I opened the plastic sleeve and pulled out the note. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant but slightly shaky from her declining health. The date at the top was marked exactly 3 days before the accident. I read the words written in blue ink. For Claire, when Bradley shows his true face. Go to First National. I read the words again, and then a third time. My breath hitched in my throat. My mother knew. She knew exactly what Bradley was capable of doing. She knew that beneath his polished corporate exterior and his expensive suits, he was a predator waiting to strike. She knew that the moment she and my father were gone, Bradley would descend on the estate and try to erase me completely. She had anticipated this exact nightmare. She had sewn a lifeline into her granddaughter's favorite toy, knowing it was the one single possession Bradley would never think to look twice at when he threw us out. I stared at the brass key resting in the palm of my hand. This was a safe deposit box key. First National was the massive bank branch in the center of downtown, a bank my parents had never openly used for their standard checking or savings accounts. A heavy sense of purpose began to replace the cold terror in my chest. Bradley thought I was just the quiet, subservient sister who would roll over and accept defeat. He thought taking my home and freezing my accounts would break my spirit. But my mother had left me a weapon. Whatever was inside that safe deposit box was the key to stopping him. I looked at the digital clock on the motel bathroom wall. It was flashing past 11 at night. The bank would not open until 9 in the morning. I had to survive the night. I had to get to that vault before Bradley figured out what was missing. Just as I carefully folded the note and tucked the brass key deeply into the front pocket of my jeans, my cell phone vibrated violently against the bathroom counter. The sudden harsh noise made me jump. I picked up the phone. The screen glared brightly in the dim light. It was a text message from Bradley. The words were a calculated strike designed to paralyze me with fear. The message read, "Hope you and the kid enjoy the streets. Just giving you a heads up. I am filing for emergency sole conservatorship of the entire estate tomorrow morning at 9. The judge is a friend of my boss. By tomorrow afternoon, I will have total legal authority to liquidate everything. Do not try to fight this. You have no money and you have no power. You are history." I stared at the glowing screen. Bradley was moving faster than I could have ever imagined. He was not just taking the house. He was legally sealing the entire estate to liquidate the assets immediately. If he got sole conservatorship approved by a judge tomorrow afternoon, anything inside that safe deposit box might be legally blocked from my access forever. I looked at the brass key in my pocket. The bank opened at 9. Bradley was filing his paperwork at 9. It was going to be a brutal race against time. He thought I had no power. He thought I was history. But tomorrow morning, I was going to walk into First National and I was going to find exactly what my mother had left behind to destroy his perfect illusion. I did not sleep a single second that night in the motel. I spent the dark hours sitting in a hard plastic chair by the window, watching the rain hammer the parking lot, my fingers gripping the small brass key I had pulled from my daughter's muddy stuffed bear. The digital clock on the nightstand flashed the hours, 3:45 in the morning. Every time the red numbers changed, I felt the tightening grip of my brother's threat. Bradley was marching into a courthouse at 9 o'clock this morning. He was going to use his corporate connections to file for emergency sole conservatorship over our parents' estate. He wanted total control to liquidate the family home, leaving me and Lily permanently on the streets. At 7, I woke Lily up. I told her we had to get ready for school. She put on the damp clothes we had salvaged from the ripped garbage bag on the porch. I brushed her hair, trying to keep my hands steady. I promised her I would pick her up right at 3 and we would go get ice cream. I drove her to her elementary school in silence. When she unbuckled her seatbelt and hugged me goodbye, I breathed in the scent of her shampoo and promised myself I would not let my brother destroy her life. I watched her run up the school steps. As soon as the heavy glass doors closed behind her, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. I had 45 minutes to get across town to First National Bank before Bradley's legal filings could potentially lock down every single asset connected to the Sutton name. My 10-year-old sedan struggled against the morning traffic. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Bradley thought he had already won. He assumed that because I had spent the last 2 years changing adult diapers, tracking medication schedules, and fighting with Medicare representatives as our parents died, I had somehow lost my spine. He confused my sacrifice for weakness. I pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank at 10 minutes to 9. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the morning air heavy and gray. I waited in my car, staring at the grand stone columns of the building. Exactly at 9, a security guard unlocked the heavy glass doors. I walked inside. The bank smelled of floor wax and cold-conditioned air. I walked straight to the customer service desk. A middle-aged man in a crisp blue suit looked up from his computer monitor. His name tag read, Mr. Davis. I took a deep breath, fighting the tremor in my voice, and told him my name. I told him I needed immediate access to my safe deposit box. Mr. Davis began typing my information into his keyboard. I stood there, my heart pounding in my throat, waiting for the inevitable alarm. I waited for him to tell me that my brother Bradley had frozen everything. Mr. Davis stopped typing. A deep frown formed on his face. He looked at me, then back at his screen. He cleared his throat and said he was terribly sorry. But there was a high-level security freeze on the primary accounts associated with my late mother, Diane Sutton. He explained that a power of attorney and an emergency conservatorship order had been flagged in their system just moments ago by a Mr. Bradley Sutton. The panic I had been holding back hit me like a physical blow. Bradley had been faster than I thought. He must have pushed the paperwork through the moment the courthouse doors opened. I gripped the edge of the polished wooden desk. I told Mr. Davis that the checking and savings accounts might be frozen, but I was not asking to withdraw money. I was asking to access a physical safe deposit box. I pulled the small brass key from my coat pocket and placed it firmly on the desk between us. I told him to look at the specific registry for the vault. I told him to look at the names on the lease agreement for that exact box. Mr. Davis adjusted his glasses and clicked his mouse a few times. The tension in the air was suffocating. I watched his eyes scan the screen. Then his posture completely changed. He looked up at me with a mix of surprise and professional respect. He said I was entirely correct. The primary financial accounts were locked under the general estate, but the safe deposit box was set up differently. It was a private lease agreement registered exclusively under 2 names, Diane Sutton and Claire Sutton. My father was not on it. Bradley was not on it. Because it was a direct co-lease, my mother's death simply left me as the sole legal owner of the box and its contents. Bradley's forged power of attorney and his emergency conservatorship over our father's estate meant absolutely nothing down in the vault. Mr. Davis stood up, grabbed a master key from a drawer, and told me to follow him. We walked past the teller windows, through a heavy steel gate, and into the silent, climate-controlled vault. The walls were lined with thousands of metal doors. He led me to a box near the bottom. Number 402. He inserted his master key, I inserted my brass key, and we turned them together. The heavy lock clicked open. Mr. Davis pulled out a long metal container, placed it in my hands, and directed me to a private viewing room. He closed the door behind me, leaving me completely alone in the quiet room. I sat down at a small table. The metal box was heavy. My hands were shaking so severely I almost dropped it. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The box smelled faintly of old paper and dried lavender. There was no cash inside. There were no diamonds or family jewels. Instead, the box was packed to the brim with thick stacks of certified financial documents, bank statements, legal notices, and printed email threads. I pulled out the first stack of papers and spread them across the table. For the past decade, I had worked as an independent medical biller. My entire career was built on spotting discrepancies. I spent my life hunting down denied claims, hidden administrative fees, fraudulent coding, and inflated insurance charges. I knew how to follow a paper trail through a labyrinth of corporate lies better than anyone. I applied that exact same analytical lens to the documents sitting in front of me. It only took me 10 minutes to realize that my brother Bradley was a complete and utter fraud. The golden child of the Sutton family. The successful corporate sales director who wore custom suits and drove a leased luxury car was drowning. He was not just broke, he was financially radioactive. The documents were a secret dossier my mother had been compiling over the last 2 years of her life. Bradley had been feeding my parents a story of immense corporate success, but the reality was that he had been borrowing money at predatory interest rates to fund a lifestyle he could never actually afford. I read through statements from aggressive private lenders. Bradley was running a shell game. He was taking out short-term high-interest loans to pay off other high-interest loans. His credit was entirely destroyed. His bank accounts were overdrawn. The fancy house he lived in with Jessica was heavily mortgaged, and they were 3 months behind on the payments. All the times he told my parents he could not visit because he was closing massive deals, he was actually dodging aggressive debt collectors. But that was not the worst of it. The deeper I dug into the metal box, the colder my blood ran. I pulled out a heavy staple-bound contract from a commercial lending firm based in Chicago. I recognized my brother's aggressive signature on the bottom line. It was a massive business loan for a failed commercial venture he had tried to launch 3 years ago. I scanned the principal amount, $450,000. My eyes moved down to the guarantor section. My heart stopped beating. There on the dotted line was the shaky, uneven signature of my father, Thomas Sutton. Bradley had secretly manipulated our father into co-signing a $450,000 commercial loan. The default notices attached to the back of the contract painted a terrifying picture. Bradley had stopped making payments a year ago. The loan had gone into severe default. The predatory lenders had immediately triggered the co-signer clause, attaching the massive debt directly to my parents' estate. This was why Bradley was moving so aggressively to seize sole conservatorship. This was why he locked me out of the house in the rain the very day we buried them. He was not just trying to steal his inheritance. He was trying to illegally liquidate the family home to pay off his massive fraudulent debt before the court system or the probate judge could audit the estate and discover his financial crimes. If he managed to sell the house for cash tomorrow, he would wire the money to his creditors, leaving me and Lily with absolutely nothing but a hollowed-out bankrupt estate. I sat back in the chair, feeling a wave of pure nausea wash over me. My parents had sacrificed everything for him. They had worshipped the ground he walked on, and he had secretly handed them a death sentence of debt, while I was the one washing their sheets and holding their hands in hospice. My mother must have found out. She must have intercepted a default notice in the mail. That was why she started compiling this hidden dossier. She knew Bradley was going to try and cover his tracks. I reached back into the bottom of the safe deposit box. There was one last item resting against the cold metal. It was a thick, heavy, cream-colored envelope. It felt substantial in my hands. I turned it over. The back of the envelope was sealed shut with a thick puddle of dark red wax. Pressed firmly into the center of the wax was an official legal seal. I looked at the front of the envelope. Printed in sharp raised black lettering was a name and an address. Harrison Cole, attorney at law. I stared at the name. I knew who Harrison Cole was. He was one of the most ruthless, high-powered estate litigation attorneys in the entire state of Pennsylvania. My parents could never have afforded a lawyer of his caliber. Yet here was a sealed document from his private office hidden safely away from Bradley's greedy hands. I ran my thumb over the red wax seal. The panic and the fear that had been paralyzing me since yesterday completely evaporated. Bradley thought he was playing a game of chess against a weak, tired caretaker. He thought he had trapped me in a corner. But as I looked at the undeniable proof of his financial crimes and the sealed envelope from Harrison Cole, I realized the truth. My mother had not just left me a warning. She had left me a loaded gun, and I was going to use it to blow my brother's perfect illusion to pieces. I walked out of First National Bank with the heavy cream envelope gripped tightly in my right hand. The morning rain had finally stopped, leaving the downtown Philadelphia streets slick and gray under a thick blanket of clouds. My 10-year-old sedan was parked 3 blocks away in a cheap hourly lot, and every single step I took back toward it felt entirely different from the steps I had taken just an hour ago. For 34 years, my default setting in this family had been quiet surrender. When my brother Bradley demanded the best slice of meat at the dinner table, I quietly handed him the plate. When he wanted the prime parking spot in the driveway, I moved my car to the street without a word. When our parents were dying and he claimed he was simply too busy closing corporate deals to help, I paused my freelance medical billing career and moved into their house to change their sheets. I had spent my entire life folding myself into smaller and smaller shapes just so Bradley could have enough room to expand. But that version of Claire Sutton died inside the vault of First National Bank. The certified financial documents I had just found inside my mother's hidden safe deposit box proved that Bradley was not a successful businessman. He was a desperate fraud, drowning in nearly $500,000 of predatory debt. And the sealed envelope I now held in my hand, stamped with the red wax crest of Harrison Cole, meant my mother had known absolutely everything. I climbed into the cold driver's seat of my sedan and locked the doors. I did not cry. I did not panic. I placed the envelope gently on the passenger seat and started the engine. For 2 years, I had fought daily battles with aggressive insurance company representatives over denied medical claims. I knew exactly how to stand my ground when the numbers did not add up. Bradley had manipulated the numbers of our entire family, but now I had the receipts. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove straight toward the financial district. Harrison Cole was not the kind of attorney you found in a local phone book. His office was located on the 42nd floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper in the absolute center of downtown. It was the kind of building designed specifically to intimidate normal people. The lobby was lined with imported Italian marble and staffed by security guards in tailored suits. As I walked through the massive revolving doors wearing my damp cheap wool coat and scuffed boots, I could feel the judgmental stares of the corporate employees passing by. Yesterday, those stares would have made me lower my eyes and rush to the nearest exit. Today, I did not care. I marched straight to the elevator banks and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The ride-up was silent and fast, making my ears pop. I watched the digital numbers climb higher and higher, taking me further away from the powerless woman I had been when Bradley kicked my daughter and me into the freezing mud. The elevator doors opened to a reception area that looked more like an art gallery than a law firm. Original oil paintings hung on pure white walls. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Behind it sat a receptionist who looked like she had just stepped off a fashion runway. She glanced up from her computer monitor, her eyes doing a quick, calculating sweep of my damp clothes and messy hair. Her polite smile did not reach her eyes. She asked if I was lost and needed directions to the service elevator. I walked directly up to the mahogany desk and looked her right in the eyes. I told her I was absolutely not lost. I stated my name was Claire Sutton and I was there to see Harrison Cole. The receptionist let out a soft, patronizing sigh. She informed me that Mr. Cole did not accept walk-in appointments under any circumstances, and that his schedule was completely booked for the next 3 months. She reached for a glossy business card to dismiss me. I did not take the card. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out the heavy cream envelope with the red wax seal, and placed it flat on the pristine surface of her desk. I told her to call Mr. Cole right now, tell him Diane Sutton's daughter was standing in the lobby, and mention that the seal on his private envelope was unbroken. The receptionist looked down at the red wax seal. Her patronizing smile vanished instantly. She picked up her sleek desk phone, pressed a single button, and spoke in a hushed, urgent whisper. Less than 30 seconds later, a tall, older man with sharp features and silver hair appeared from a heavy oak door down the hallway. He wore a flawless navy blue suit. His posture was perfectly rigid, exuding the kind of dry, precise authority that commanded total obedience. He walked up to the reception desk, picked up the envelope, examined the unbroken seal, and then looked directly at me. He did not offer a comforting smile or empty condolences about my parents' passing. He simply said, "Claire, I have been waiting for you. Please come into my office." I followed him down the long corridor, my boots silent on the thick plush carpet. His private office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray expanse of the city. One entire wall was covered in thick legal volumes. He directed me to sit in a leather chair across from his massive desk. He sat down, placed the envelope perfectly in the center of his blotter, and pulled a silver letter opener from his drawer. "Your mother was an incredibly intelligent woman," Cole said, his voice low and measured. "She called me 3 weeks ago. She was terrified not for herself, but for you and your daughter." I sat forward in my chair. I told him I had found the safe deposit box. I told him I saw the loan documents, the default notices, and the forged signature where Bradley had manipulated our father into co-signing a $450,000 commercial loan. Cole nodded slowly, slicing cleanly through the top of the envelope. He pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. "Your parents discovered Bradley's financial abuse exactly 1 week before the car accident that took their lives," Cole explained. "Your father intercepted a final notice of default from a predatory lending firm in Chicago. Bradley had been intercepting their mail for months, but he missed one letter. When your father confronted him, Bradley lied. He claimed it was a minor accounting error. But your mother knew better. She hired a private investigator to look into his businesses." Cole leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "They were completely devastated, Claire. Your father had spent his entire life bragging about his successful corporate son. He realized that the son he idolized was nothing but a grifter who had secretly placed a massive lien against the family home. And more importantly, your parents realized something else. They realized they had spent decades taking you completely for granted." A hard lump formed in my throat, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. I was not going to cry in this office. I was going to fight. I asked Cole what the documents in front of him meant for the estate. I told him Bradley had already changed the locks on the house, thrown my daughter and me into a cheap motel, and used a forged power of attorney to freeze my joint banking account. I explained that Bradley had sent me a text message this morning stating he was going to court to file for emergency sole conservatorship. Cole did not look surprised. In fact, a dangerous, calculating sharpness appeared in his eyes. He leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the desk. Bradley is a desperate man making desperate mistakes, Cole said softly. He is drowning, and he knows his lenders are preparing to seize his personal assets. If he goes down, his wife Jessica will leave him, and his corporate reputation will be destroyed. He needs cash immediately. That is why he is trying to bypass standard probate. I asked exactly how Bradley planned to do that. With my background in medical billing, I understood the terrifying speed of aggressive debt collection, but estate law was different. Cole explained the trap Bradley was currently setting. Bradley is using that forged power of attorney to establish himself as the sole protector of the estate. Because you have traditionally been the quiet, compliant sister, he assumes you will not contest his filings. He plans to claim to the judge that the estate is in financial peril and needs immediate liquidation. He already has a cash buyer lined up for the family home, a corporate flipper who buys properties under market value for pure cash. I remembered the real estate investor I had seen entering the house. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind. If the judge grants him emergency conservatorship, Cole continued, his voice growing incredibly serious. Bradley will sign the deed over to the cash buyer by this afternoon. The money will be wired into an estate account that he completely controls. Within 24 hours, he will transfer those funds to offshore accounts to anonymously pay off his loan sharks before the court can properly audit your parents' finances. Once that money leaves the country, it will be gone forever. You and your daughter will be left with absolutely nothing. The sheer scale of my brother's greed was breathtaking. He was perfectly willing to render his own sister and his 8-year-old niece homeless just to save his own miserable reputation. He was willing to erase our parents' legacy to pay off criminals. The rage inside me burned hotter and brighter than before, incinerating the last remaining traces of the quiet, obedient daughter I used to be. I looked Harrison Cole straight in the eye. I told him that I refused to let my brother win. I told him I wanted to file an injunction immediately. I wanted to march into the courthouse, present the evidence from the safe deposit box, and have Bradley arrested for fraud. Cole held up a hand to stop me. If we file an injunction right now, Bradley will simply pivot. He will hire a team of aggressive defense attorneys, claim the loan documents are fake, and drag this estate through years of brutal litigation. The property will be tied up in court, the legal fees will drain the remaining cash, and you will spend the next 5 years fighting a war of attrition while living in a $50 motel. I gripped the armrests of my leather chair. I asked him what other option we had. If we did not stop Bradley today, the money would be gone tomorrow. Cole pulled a single heavy document from the stack on his desk. It was bound with a thick blue ribbon. Your parents came to me 3 days before they died. We completely restructured their entire estate plan. We drafted a new will that supersedes everything Bradley thinks he controls. But we have to play this perfectly. Cole explained that if we attacked Bradley now, he would have time to formulate a defense. We needed to let Bradley walk straight into his own execution. We needed to let him gather his creditors, let him process the initial paperwork with the cash buyer, and let him feel the absolute certainty of his victory. We needed him to bring every single person he owed money to into one room for the official reading of the will, thinking he was about to hand them a fortune. Bradley is fueled by his own arrogance, Cole said, his voice cold and precise. He wants to humiliate you. He wants to prove to his creditors that he is the wealthy, successful son he always claimed to be. We are going to let him organize the reading. We are going to let him sit at the head of the table. We are going to let him build the trap himself. I stared at the heavy document on Cole's desk. I realized what he was asking me to do. He was asking me to go back to that dingy, damp motel room. He was asking me to play the role of the defeated, invisible sister. He was asking me to endure my brother's insults and my sister-in-law's mocking text messages without saying a single word in my own defense. I had to let them think they had successfully ruined my life. Cole looked at me, his sharp eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation. To stop him, we have to let him believe he has won until the official reading. I need you to be completely invisible. Can you stay silent for exactly 5 days? I thought about Lily sleeping in that cold motel bed. I thought about the garbage bags sitting in the mud. I thought about 34 years of being told I owned nothing. I looked back at the attorney and nodded my head. I was going to be the quietest I had ever been. Because when the time finally came to speak, my words were going to break my brother in half. I spent the next 48 hours living inside a lie. Harrison Cole had been incredibly clear in his instructions. If I wanted to trap my brother Bradley and save our parents' estate from being liquidated to pay off predatory loan sharks, I had to let him believe he had utterly destroyed me. I had to swallow my pride, sit in that cheap $50 a night roadside motel, and play the role of the defeated invisible sister. It was the hardest performance of my entire life. I woke up on Wednesday morning on a sagging mattress that smelled of bleach and stale smoke. The wall unit radiator was rattling loudly. I made instant oatmeal using water from the bathroom tap for my 8-year-old daughter, Lily. I smiled at her, smoothed her hair, and told her we were just having a funny camping trip. I walked her to the bus stop down the street, waving until the yellow school bus disappeared around the corner. The second she was out of sight, my smile vanished. The reality of my situation crashed down on me. My joint bank accounts were still frozen by Bradley's forged power of attorney. My only shelter was a room I had paid for with the absolute last of my cash. I had a multi-million-dollar loaded gun sitting in a lawyer's safe. But until the will reading on Friday afternoon, I was technically homeless. I got into my 10-year-old sedan. The heater was broken, so I sat shivering in my damp coat. I needed to know what Bradley was doing. I needed to know how fast he was moving to liquidate the assets before the probate court could audit his fraudulent commercial loans. I drove across town, winding through the familiar, tree-lined streets of the wealthy Pennsylvania suburb, where I had spent the last 2 years changing my parents' hospice bedding. When I turned onto Maple Lane, my foot slammed on the brake pedal. Both sides of the wide suburban street were completely choked with parked cars. Pickup trucks, luxury SUVs, and rusted vans were haphazardly angled onto the manicured lawns. Staked at the end of the driveway was a massive, bright neon green sign with thick black lettering. It read, "Estate sale today. Everything must go. Cash only." My chest seized. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. Bradley was not even waiting for the emergency conservatorship paperwork to be finalized by a judge. He was illegally liquidating the physical contents of the house right this very second to generate untraceable cash. I pulled my car behind a landscaping truck and turned off the engine. I watched in absolute horror as total strangers walked out of my childhood home carrying the intimately familiar pieces of my life. A man in muddy work boots carried my mother's antique cherrywood sewing table down the front steps. 2 women wrestled with the heavy brass floor lamps that used to stand in my father's study. Another man was rolling out the custom leather recliner where my father had spent the last agonizing months of his life. Bradley was selling our family history for pennies on the dollar to anyone with cash in their pockets. I got out of my car and walked toward the house. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I forced my face to remain completely blank. I remembered what Attorney Cole had said. I had to let them think they had won. The front doors were propped wide open. People were swarming through the foyer like vultures picking over a carcass. Standing on the covered porch holding a thick clipboard and a steaming cup of expensive coffee was my sister-in-law, Jessica. She was wearing a tailored cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed designer slacks. She was pointing a manicured finger, barking orders at a couple of hired movers who were carrying out boxes of my parents' fine china. Jessica turned her head and spotted me walking up the driveway. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk spread across her face. She handed her coffee to one of the movers and walked down the slate steps to intercept me before I could reach the front door. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Jessica said, her voice dripping with venomous pity. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my damp, cheap coat and my scuffed boots. "I told Bradley you would come crawling back once the reality of living in a filthy motel set in. I hope you did not come here to beg for your room back. As you can see, we are busy cleaning out the trash." I looked past her shoulder at a stranger carrying out a box of my mother's vintage vinyl records. I felt a sudden, violent urge to push Jessica aside and scream at everyone to drop my family's belongings. But I took a slow, measured breath. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch. I engineered my posture to project total defeat. "I just came to get the rest of Lily's school books," I said, keeping my voice quiet and shaky. "You threw them in a garbage bag and they got ruined in the rain. She needs them for class." Jessica let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, please, Claire. Do not try to play the tragic mother card with me. It is pathetic." She stood blocking my path, tapping her pen against her clipboard. Her arrogance was absolutely suffocating. It immediately transported me back to every single family holiday over the past decade. I remembered Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Jessica had been drinking heavy red wine and gesturing wildly while telling a story about her luxury vacation. She knocked her entire crystal glass onto the Persian rug. She did not even flinch. She just looked directly at me, snapped her fingers, and said, "Claire, be a dear and grab the carpet cleaner before this stains." Bradley had laughed. My parents had said nothing. I was always treated as the hired help in my own family. They assumed I had no pride, no ambition, and no backbone. Jessica flipped to the second page on her clipboard and pulled out a crisp single sheet of heavy legal paper. She held it out toward me. "Bradley knew you would come back sniffing around for a handout," she said, her tone suddenly shifting to a practiced corporate sweetness. "He is actually a very generous brother. He wants to help you out, Claire. We know you do not have a dime to your name. We know your accounts are locked, so we are offering you a deal. I looked at the papers in her hand. What kind of deal? I asked softly. Jessica smiled like a predator. It is a simple waiver of rights, a standard release form. You sign this piece of a paper acknowledging that Bradley is the sole executor and sole beneficiary of the estate. You legally waive your right to contest the probate process or request an audit of the assets. In exchange for your signature right now, Bradley is willing to give you a box of your old childhood photographs that we were going to throw in the dumpster anyway. And because we feel sorry for your daughter, I will personally give you $100 in cash so you can buy her a decent meal tonight. She reached into her designer pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, holding it next to the legal waiver. She was offering me $100 and a box of sentimental cardboard to sign away my legal rights to a multi-million-dollar estate. She wanted me to sign away my ability to expose Bradley's $450,000 fraudulent loan. For the past 10 years, I had worked exclusively in medical billing. My entire professional life consisted of battling aggressive, predatory insurance adjusters who tried to trick exhausted patients into signing away their coverage rights. I dealt with corporate manipulation every single day. I knew exactly how to dismantle a bad faith negotiation. The first rule was never to show your anger. The second rule was to read every single line of the fine print while playing incredibly stupid. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the clipboard from her. I let my eyes widen, acting as if the $100 bill was a life-saving fortune. I stared at the legal waiver. My professional brain instantly dissected the text. It was not a standard release form. It was a highly specific, aggressively worded indemnity clause drafted by a desperate lawyer. It specifically stated that the signatory released Bradley Sutton from any and all liability regarding the transfer of real estate debts and the assumption of commercial loans. Bradley was terrified. He was trying to force me into providing legal cover for his financial crimes before the judge even looked at his emergency conservatorship petition. Jessica tapped her expensive shoe on the wet pavement. Just sign it at the bottom, Claire. Take the money and go back to your motel. It is more than you deserve anyway. I let out a heavy sigh, making sure to sound overwhelmed and completely broken. I do not know, Jessica. This has a lot of big legal words. It says things about commercial loans and real estate transfers. I do not really understand what I am signing. I just wanted Lily's math workbook. Jessica rolled her eyes, her patience instantly evaporating. God, you are so simple-minded. It is standard boilerplate language, Claire. It just means you agree not to drag us into court and waste our time because you are bitter that Dad left the house to his successful child. Bradley has important business to handle today, and we need to wrap up this loose end. I looked down at the paper, pretending to hesitate. Who is the buyer? I asked innocently. Bradley said yesterday he had a cash buyer for the house. Why do you need me to sign this if he already has the power of attorney? Jessica snatched the clipboard back from my hands, her face flushing with irritation. Because title companies are annoying and demand clean family releases before they wire the funds. Not that you would understand how real estate transactions work. Just as she said those words, a large black luxury SUV pulled up directly behind my parked sedan. The doors opened and two men stepped out. One was my brother Bradley. He was wearing an expensive trench coat and holding a leather briefcase. The man walking next to him caught my immediate attention. He wore a sharp gray suit, carried a laser measuring device, and possessed the cold, predatory demeanor of a corporate shark. I recognized the type instantly. This was the cash for keys investor. This was the man who was going to buy our family home for a fraction of its worth, so Bradley could quickly wire the money overseas to his loan sharks. Bradley and the investor walked up the driveway, completely ignoring the estate sale customers hauling out my mother's furniture. Bradley spotted me standing near the porch. He stopped walking. His jaw clenched in fury. He marched straight over to us, grabbing Jessica by the elbow. "What is she doing here?" Bradley hissed, glaring at me like I was a stray dog digging through his trash. "Did you get her to sign the waiver?" Jessica looked incredibly annoyed. "She is being difficult. She is whining about reading the fine print." Bradley turned his cold, dead eyes onto me. He stepped deeply into my personal space. I could smell the expensive cologne he wore to mask his desperation. "Listen to me very carefully, Claire," he said in a low, threatening tone. "I am closing the deal on this property on Friday afternoon at exactly 3:00. The money is going to be wired directly into a holding account that I control. If you do not sign that waiver by tomorrow morning, I will make sure the judge permanently seals the bank accounts. You will not get a single penny. You will not get a photograph. You will get nothing." I looked past Bradley's shoulder. I looked at the corporate investor standing near the front door, impatiently checking his gold wristwatch. I processed the timeline Bradley had just handed me. Friday afternoon at exactly 3:00. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm in my ears. Friday at 3 o'clock was the exact date and time Attorney Harrison Cole had scheduled the official reading of my parents' final legally binding will. Bradley was timing his fraudulent real estate closing to happen at the exact same moment he assumed he would be granted the emergency conservatorship. He believed the will reading was going to be a simple formality where an old 2018 document would legally hand him the keys to the kingdom. He intended to walk out of that lawyer's conference room and instantly sign the deed over to the cash investor sitting in his lobby. The sheer audacity of his timeline was breathtaking. He was building his own execution chamber and organizing the guest list himself. I looked back at my brother's furious, arrogant face. I did not raise my voice. I did not show him an ounce of the immense power currently sitting in my coat pocket. I let my shoulders drop even further. I wrapped my arms around my chest as if I was desperately trying to keep warm. "I just need to think about it, Bradley," I whispered, staring down at my muddy boots. "It is just a lot of pressure. I will let you know before Friday." Bradley scoffed a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. He turned to the investor and offered a loud, booming laugh. "Sorry about the interruption, Richard. Just dealing with some unfortunate family baggage. Let us go inside and look at the crown molding. The closing documents are already being drafted for Friday." I turned around and walked back to my car. I did not look back at the house. I did not look at my mother's furniture being loaded into pickup trucks. I drove back to the damp, miserable motel room. I sat at the tiny laminate desk, pulled out my laptop, and spent the entire night meticulously organizing the financial routing numbers I had memorized from the documents in the safe deposit box. I had 3 days left to survive in silence. I had 3 days to let my brother build his perfect trap. Because when Friday at 3 o'clock finally arrived, he was going to find out that the sister he treated like a servant was actually the architect of his total destruction. I drove back to the Starlight Motel with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles physically ached. The image of my childhood home being stripped bare by strangers was burned permanently into my mind. Bradley was selling our parents' history for pennies on the dollar to anyone with cash in their pockets, and he was doing it right in front of my face. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive my car straight through his temporary estate sale sign. But I could not let the burning anger consume me. Anger was reckless, and right now I needed cold, calculated precision. I parked the car outside room 112. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcefully smoothing my expression before unlocking the cheap wooden door. Lily was sitting on the sagging mattress, watching a bright, noisy cartoon on the grainy television. I smiled at her, kissed the top of her head, and told her we were going to order a massive pizza for dinner to celebrate our camping trip. After we ate, I tucked her into the thin motel bed. I sat beside her in the dim light, humming a soft lullaby my mother used to sing, and waited until her breathing grew slow and perfectly steady. Once I was absolutely sure she was completely asleep, I walked over to the tiny, scratched laminate desk in the far corner of the room. I set down the heavy metal safe deposit box I had retrieved from First National Bank earlier that morning. I opened my laptop and plugged it into the wall. The digital clock on the bottom corner of my screen read 9 o'clock on Wednesday night. I had less than 48 hours until Friday at 3 in the afternoon. Bradley had practically handed me his exact timeline on a silver platter. He was going to walk into Harrison Cole's downtown office, listen to what he thought was the old will demand his emergency sole conservatorship, and immediately sign the property deed over to his cash buyer. If I failed to stop him before that transaction was completed, he would wire millions of dollars into offshore accounts to satisfy his aggressive creditors. My parents' estate would be completely drained, and Lily and I would be permanently erased from the family legacy. The timeline was dangerously tight. But Bradley had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He thought I was just a tired, emotionally broken medical biller who spent her days arguing with hospital receptionists. He completely forgot that my entire professional career was built on tracking missing money, auditing fraudulent claims, and finding the truth buried under mountains of complex corporate paperwork. I opened the metal box and pulled out the thick stacks of certified financial documents my mother had meticulously gathered before her fatal accident. I spread them across the motel desk, organizing them by date, by lending institution, and by account number. I turned on the small flickering desk lamp, casting a tight circle of yellow light over the papers. I booted up my professional accounting software. For the next 7 hours, the cheap, damp motel room completely vanished around me. I was completely in my element. I started with the massive $450,000 commercial loan contract, the one Bradley had manipulated my sick father into co-signing 3 years ago. I needed to know exactly where that money had gone, how it had been spent, and who exactly held the default debt now. I traced the original lender, It was a predatory commercial credit group operating out of Chicago. But aggressive lenders rarely keep bad debt on their own books. They package it and sell it. I cross-referenced the collection notices my mother had intercepted from my parents' mail. I looked closely at the tiny routing numbers listed at the very bottom of the threatening letters. Using my laptop, I began running those specific routing numbers through public financial databases and corporate registry sites I utilized for medical insurance audits. I followed the digital paper trail with absolute relentless focus. It was worse than I thought. I discovered that Bradley had not just taken out one massive loan. He had created a tangled, chaotic web of shell companies to hide his failures. He opened a limited liability corporation registered in Delaware to purchase commercial equipment he never actually bought. When the money ran dry, he took out short-term high-interest bridge loans to cover the monthly payments on his leased luxury cars, his custom suits, and his expensive country club memberships. He was funding an illusion of massive corporate success using completely borrowed money. When those bridge loans inevitably defaulted, he opened new secret lines of credit under his wife's name. Jessica was either completely complicit in the fraud, or she was entirely blind to the fact that her husband was ruining her credit score too. I typed every single figure, every date, and every interest rate into my master spreadsheet. My fingers flew across the keyboard in the quiet room. The numbers painted a crystal-clear picture of a man who was financially suffocating. Bradley was currently over $800,000 in debt. His personal bank accounts were running on fumes. He was dodging calls from aggressive collection agencies on a daily basis. The cash for keys deal on our parents' estate was his absolute last resort. If he did not secure that immediate untraceable cash from the real estate investor by Friday afternoon, his entire life would collapse into public bankruptcy and potential criminal fraud charges for forging financial documents. I tracked the specific bank routing number he had set up to receive the final cash transfer from the real estate investor. It was an offshore holding account based in the Cayman Islands. He was planning to take the money and vanish entirely, leaving his vicious creditors to seize our parents' home and leaving me and my daughter on the street with absolutely nothing. I worked straight through the night. I did not stop to eat. I did not stop to sleep. I drank tepid water from the bathroom sink just to stay awake. By 4 a.m, my eyes were burning, but my master spreadsheet was completely finished. I began generating the official reports. I compiled a flawless, verified financial dossier proving Bradley's total and complete insolvency. I included every single default notice, every banking tracking number, every shell company corporate registry, and the exact certified balance of his outstanding debts. I created summary pages with clear, undeniable financial graphs. Numbers are beautiful because they contain no emotion. They do not care who the favorite golden child is. They do not care about expensive tailored suits or fake corporate titles. They only tell the absolute truth. And the truth sitting on my laptop screen proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Bradley Sutton was a broke, desperate, manipulative criminal. But proving his massive fraud to the estate attorney was only the first half of my plan. I had to ensure that the real estate transaction he had scheduled for Friday afternoon could not physically go through. I had to build an invisible legal wall around the family home that his sleazy cash buyer could not cross. I saved the encrypted financial dossier to 3 separate flash drives and uploaded a secure backup to a private password-protected cloud server. I printed physical copies of the entire report using the small coin-operated business center in the motel lobby as soon as the sun came up on Thursday morning. I bound the pages into thick professional presentation folders. The trap was fully constructed on paper. Now I just needed to coordinate the final strike. At exactly 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, I stepped out into the motel parking lot and called attorney Harrison Cole. He answered on the very first ring. I told him I had finished the financial audit of the documents found in the safe deposit box. I gave him the exact figures. I told him about the $450,000 initial commercial loan, the forged signature, and the subsequent bridge loans that brought Bradley's total debt to over $800,000. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Cole told me my mother was absolutely right to trust me with this. He said my forensic accounting work was perfectly executed and would hold up in any probate court in the country. Then I told him about the corporate real estate investor I had seen walking through the house during the estate sale. I gave Cole the exact name of the title company the investor was likely using based on a logo I had spotted on the man's leather clipboard. Cole immediately understood my strategy. If the title company knew there was a pending highly contested legal dispute over the legitimate ownership of the property, they could not legally issue title insurance. Without clean title insurance, no legitimate real estate investor would ever authorize a wire transfer for hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. Cole told me he would handle the blockade personally. He promised to file a quiet preliminary injunction directly with the specific title company and the county clerk's office. This injunction would place a hard, unbreakable legal cloud on the title for the property on Maple Lane. The brilliant part of this strategy was that the title company was legally prohibited from discussing the injunction with Bradley or the buyer until the exact moment they attempted to finalize the closing documents. We were locking the door from the inside, and Bradley had absolutely no idea he was walking into a brick wall. Cole instructed me to remain completely silent for the next 24 hours. He told me to let Bradley continue his arrogant parade around town, let him finish packing up the house, let him brag to his creditors that he was about to be a millionaire, let him walk into the law firm conference room on Friday afternoon fully believing he was the king of the world. I agreed to the plan. I hung up the phone and looked up at the gray morning sky. For the first time since my parents died in that horrible crash, I felt a deep anchoring sense of peace. I was not helpless anymore. I was armed. Thursday dragged by with agonizing slowness. I spent the day with Lily, taking her to a cheap indoor playground, buying her ice cream, and listening to her laugh. I refused to let her see a single ounce of my anxiety. I checked my phone constantly, but I sent absolutely no messages. I ignored 5 consecutive phone calls from my brother. He was likely calling to bully me into signing that ridiculous liability waiver Jessica had shoved in my face on the porch. I let every single call go straight to voicemail. I needed him to think I was too intimidated to even answer the phone. I slept soundly on Thursday night. When I woke up on Friday morning, the air in the cramped motel room felt completely different. It was the day of the official will reading. It was the day of absolute reckoning. I showered and dressed carefully. I put on a sharp black tailored suit I had kept pristine in a plastic garment bag. I pulled my hair back into a neat, severe professional style. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was finally ready to reclaim her life. I packed the thick-bound financial dossiers into my heavy leather tote bag. At exactly 8 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated loudly on the bathroom counter. The screen lit up with a new text message notification. It was from Bradley. I picked up the phone and read the words he had typed. The message was dripping with unearned victory and absolute malice. Hope you and the kid enjoy the streets. I am signing the house away at 3 in the afternoon. You own nothing. You are history. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. I did not reply. I simply locked my phone, picked up my heavy leather bag, and walked out of the motel room into the morning light. He thought I was history, but he was about to find out that the invisible sister he treated like garbage was actually the architect of his total destruction. I arrived at the prestigious law firm of Harrison Cole at exactly 2 in the afternoon on Friday. The relentless freezing rain that had battered Pennsylvania for the past 3 days had finally cleared, leaving the downtown Philadelphia streets painfully bright and slick with dirty water. The building was a towering, monolithic structure of glass and steel, the kind of architectural fortress designed specifically to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. I walked through the massive, revolving doors. My stomach was tied in tight, agonizing knots, but my hands were completely steady. I was wearing the black tailored suit I had purchased 5 years ago for my medical billing conferences. It was clean, properly pressed, and commanded respect. I no longer looked like the exhausted, defeated hospice caretaker my brother had shoved out into the mud. I looked like a seasoned professional. I felt like a soldier walking onto a completely rigged battlefield. I rode the silent high-speed elevator up to the 42nd floor. I watched the digital numbers climb higher and higher, taking me further away from the powerless woman I had been when Bradley kicked my daughter and me out of our home. When I stepped into the reception area, the quiet, intimidating hum of generational wealth surrounded me. The dark mahogany walls absorbed all the ambient sound. The thick plush carpet silenced my footsteps completely. A stern-looking legal assistant directed me to the main conference room at the very end of the long corridor. It was a massive, imposing room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire sprawling city grid. A long, perfectly polished walnut table sat in the dead center, surrounded by heavy, expensive leather chairs. I chose a seat at the very far end of the table. I absolutely did not want to sit in the middle. I wanted to see the entire room. I wanted to control my line of sight. Most importantly, I wanted to watch every single micro-expression on my brother's face when his entire world collapsed. I sat down and folded my hands neatly in my lap. Inside my right pocket, my fingers brushed against a small, worn piece of wood. It was a flat carpenter's pencil. My father had given it to me when I was 9 years old. He had been building a wooden birdhouse in the backyard, and I had sat patiently in the grass for 4 hours handing him nails and tools. He had tucked that flat pencil behind my ear, smiled warmly, and told me I was his best helper. It was one of the very few childhood memories I possessed where I felt truly seen and valued by him. It happened before the blatant favoritism completely consumed our family dynamic, before Bradley was crowned the golden child who could do no wrong. I held on to that pencil now like a physical anchor. It kept me completely grounded. It reminded me of the father I used to know long before Bradley manipulated him into signing away his life on a fraudulent commercial loan. At exactly 2:45, the heavy wooden doors of the conference room swung open with a violent push. Bradley walked in. He did not just enter the room, he invaded it. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit with a silk tie that screamed corporate arrogance. His hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. He wore a heavy, ostentatious gold watch that caught the bright sunlight pouring through the windows. He looked exactly like a man arriving to accept a massive life-changing corporate award. His wife Jessica walked in right behind him, clicking her expensive heels on the hardwood perimeter. She was draped in a black designer dress that clung tightly to her frame. Thick, dazzling diamond earrings rested on her earlobes, and a heavy, sparkling tennis bracelet hung loosely on her wrist. She looked like she was attending an exclusive gala event, not the somber reading of her in-law's final will and testament. They were both practically vibrating with a toxic, arrogant energy. But they were not alone. 2 other men followed them into the private legal conference room. I recognized one of them instantly. It was the corporate real estate investor I had seen walking through my parents' house during that illegal, unauthorized estate sale on Wednesday. He wore the same sharp gray suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase. He had the cold, dead, predatory eyes of a man who routinely bought family tragedies for pennies on the dollar and flipped them for massive profit. The second man was older, heavily built, and possessed a deeply angry, impatient demeanor. He wore a cheap, wrinkled suit and scowled heavily at the expensive mahogany walls. I knew exactly who he was without needing a formal introduction. I had memorized the names of every single predator listed on Bradley's fraudulent loan documents while sitting at my motel desk. This man was the primary debt collector from the aggressive commercial lending firm in Chicago. Bradley owed his company hundreds of thousands of dollars in defaulted bridge loans. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, my fingers tightening fiercely around the wooden pencil in my pocket. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of my brother was almost impossible to fully comprehend. He had deliberately invited his biggest, most aggressive creditor and his cash buyer to a deeply private family will reading. He brought them here as his personal captive audience. He wanted to use my parents' legally binding will as a theatrical prop to prove his phantom wealth. He intended to show these dangerous, impatient men that he was about to inherit a multi-million-dollar estate. He wanted them to physically watch him take the crown so they would stop threatening to ruin him. Bradley led his bizarre entourage to the absolute head of the long table. He pulled out a heavy leather chair for Jessica with a theatrical flourish, and then took the master seat directly at the center. It was exactly the spot where the legal executor of the estate was supposed to sit. He gestured grandly for the real estate investor and the angry debt collector to sit in the secondary chairs lining the back wall. Then Bradley finally looked down the long, polished walnut table and saw me sitting in the shadows. His confident, gleaming smile immediately twisted into a sneer of absolute, unadulterated disgust. He scoffed loudly, making absolutely sure his captive audience heard him disrespect me. "Well," he announced, his voice booming and echoing in the large room, "look who actually found the courage to show up today. I thought you would be busy moving into a downtown homeless shelter by now, Claire. I guess you came here hoping the lawyer might hand you a leftover charity check." Jessica let out a sharp, cruel laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She leaned over the table and placed her expensive designer handbag directly in the center, claiming even more space. "We already warned you about this, Claire. You are completely wasting your time. There is absolutely nothing here for you. We gave you a very generous chance to take $100 and walk away with your dignity intact. Now you get to leave this building with absolutely nothing." The heavy-set debt collector in the corner shifted aggressively in his chair. He looked at Bradley with a deep, menacing scowl. "Is this whole family reunion going to take long, Bradley? You promised me a certified bank check by 5 o'clock today. My firm is completely done waiting for our money. We are not playing games anymore." Bradley waved his hand dismissively at the angry man, projecting a false, sickeningly sweet confidence. "Relax, Marcus. The legal paperwork today is just a tedious formality. My parents always knew the entire estate goes to the successful son. They knew I was the only person capable of managing their financial legacy. My sister sitting over there is just a freelance medical biller. She spent the last 2 years wiping down kitchen counters and changing bedpans while I was out building a massive corporate empire. My father made his choice a very long time ago. He looked directly at me. His eyes were cold, hollow, and completely devoid of any human empathy. You really should have stayed at that cheap motel, Claire. Sitting here and watching me sign the house deed over to my buyer is only going to break your fragile little heart. I did not react. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not defend my difficult vital medical billing career. Nor did I mention the countless sleepless nights I stayed awake holding our dying mother's fragile hand. I sat quietly, breathing slowly and evenly. I looked at the real estate investor who was already pulling a cash transfer contract from his sleek briefcase. I looked at the furious debt collector who was waiting like a vulture to drain my parents' entire estate. And I looked at my older brother, completely oblivious to the massive fact that he was standing on a trapdoor of his own making. I held the small carpenter pencil in my pocket. I let him talk. I let him build his own execution chamber. At exactly 3:00 in the afternoon, the heavy oak doors opened again. Attorney Harrison Cole walked into the conference room. He moved with absolute terrifying precision. He wore a dark, strictly conservative suit and carried a thick, heavy leather portfolio firmly under his right arm. He walked straight toward the head of the table. Bradley immediately stood up, offering a broad, fake smile, extending his hand as if they were old, equal business partners. Harrison Cole did not take his hand. Cole looked down at Bradley's outstretched palm with mild disdain and then looked around the room. His sharp, calculating eyes landed immediately on the real estate investor and the debt collector sitting against the back wall. Mr. Sutton, Cole said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. This is a private reading of a last will and testament. It is a highly sensitive, closed legal proceeding. Who exactly are these gentlemen? Bradley puffed out his chest, completely unbothered by the attorney's icy, authoritative tone. They are my vital business associates, Mr. Cole. They have a vested financial interest in the immediate liquidation of the estate assets today. As the sole executor and primary beneficiary, I authorize their presence in this room. We are going to fast-track the cash sale of the house the second you finish reading the document. I watched Cole's face very closely. To anyone else in the room, his expression remained perfectly blank. But I knew exactly what he was doing. He was legally noting Bradley's arrogant admission on the permanent record. Bradley was openly declaring his intention to illegally bypass probate and instantly liquidate the estate for personal debt relief. Cole slowly opened his leather portfolio. He did not argue with my brother. He simply nodded his head once. Very well. If you insist on having a public audience for this proceeding, they may stay. But they are not permitted to speak. Cole took his rightful seat at the head of the table, forcing Bradley to sit back down. He pulled out a thin, light blue folder. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the paper. We are gathered here today to execute the final wishes of Thomas and Diane Sutton. I will begin by addressing the previous testamentary documents currently on file. Cole opened the blue folder. I hold in my hand the last will and testament drafted by your parents in October of 2018. Bradley leaned back heavily in his expensive leather chair and smirked. He looked across the long table at me, his eyes gleaming with absolute toxic victory. Jessica reached over and patted his arm proudly. This was the exact document they had been waiting for. The old will. The will drafted back when my parents still fully believed Bradley was a wealthy, highly successful corporate star. The will that gave him the entire house, the land, and the entire bank account. However, Cole continued, his voice suddenly slicing through Bradley's arrogant silence like a scalpel. This document is entirely null and void. Bradley's smug smirk vanished instantly. He sat up straight, his hands gripping the edge of the walnut table. What do you mean, void? Cole closed the blue folder and pushed it completely off to the side of his desk, discarding it like trash. He reached back into his leather portfolio. He pulled out a new, incredibly thick document. It was sealed inside a heavy cream envelope tightly bound with a dark red wax crest. Cole said softly, making everyone strain to hear him, that your parents visited my office exactly 5 days before the tragic accident that took their lives. They became aware of certain severe financial realities. They revoked the 2018 will in its entirety. I am now opening their final, legally binding testament. Cole broke the thick red wax seal. The loud tearing sound echoed violently in the dead silent room. Bradley stared at the heavy cream envelope, all the color draining rapidly from his face. The trap was finally sprung. The heavy cream envelope yielded to the sharp edge of Harrison Cole's silver letter opener, with a crisp slicing sound that echoed loudly across the quiet mahogany conference room. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the long walnut table. My hands were folded neatly in my lap. My thumb traced the smooth, worn edge of the wooden carpenter's pencil my father had given me decades ago. At the head of the table, my brother Bradley sat completely frozen. The smug, victorious smile had entirely vanished from his face, replaced rapidly by a look of profound confusion and rising panic. Next to him, his wife Jessica slowly lowered her cell phone, the heavy diamond earrings suddenly looking completely ridiculous on her pale, tense neck. Cole pulled a thick stack of pristine white pages from the heavy envelope. He smoothed them flat against his leather desk blotter with absolute deliberate precision. He did not look up at my brother. He simply adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. This is the final, legally binding last will and testament of Thomas and Diane Sutton. Cole began, his voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. It was drafted, signed, and properly notarized exactly 5 days prior to their passing. As explicitly stated in the opening clauses, this document completely and irrevocably revokes any and all previous wills, codicils, and estate plans, specifically and permanently nullifying the document drafted in October of 2018. Bradley gripped the armrests of his heavy leather chair. His knuckles turned completely white against the dark material. He opened his mouth to speak, but the dry, authoritative tone of the attorney completely steamrolled right over him before he could utter a single word. Cole continued reading the formal legal preamble. The room was absolutely silent. The only sound was the steady hum of the climate control system and the faint rustle of the thick paper as Cole turned to the second page. I shifted my gaze toward the back wall. The aggressive debt collector from Chicago was leaning forward in his chair. His thick arms were crossed over his chest, and his eyes were darting rapidly back and forth between Cole and my brother. Next to him, the sharp corporate real estate investor sat perfectly rigid. The cash transfer contract he had been holding was now resting completely forgotten on his lap. I direct your attention to Article 3 of this document, Cole said, looking up briefly to ensure every single person in the room was listening. This section contains a personal statement from Thomas and Diane Sutton, which they mandated must be explicitly read aloud in the presence of their legal heirs. Cole looked back down at the paper. His voice took on a slightly different cadence as he read my parents' final devastating words. We, Thomas and Diane Sutton, have spent our lives building a legacy of financial stability and familial trust. We trusted our son Bradley to honor that legacy. However, in the final weeks of our lives, we discovered a profound and devastating betrayal. We became aware of severe financial misconduct committed by our son. We intercepted legal notices proving that Bradley forged Thomas Sutton's signature on a massive commercial loan document. We discovered that Bradley is currently hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in defaulted predatory debt. He has continuously lied to us about his professional success, choosing instead to live a fraudulent lifestyle funded by illegal loans that he actively attempted to secretly attach to our family estate. The silence that fell over the conference room was absolute and entirely suffocating. It felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. Bradley looked like he had been physically struck by a speeding truck. His mouth hung slightly open. His custom-tailored navy blue suit suddenly seemed entirely too big for his shrinking frame. Jessica was staring at her husband with wide, terrified eyes. She looked like she wanted to crawl under the heavy wooden table and disappear completely. Against the back wall, the Chicago debt collector let out a low, menacing breath. He stared directly at the back of Bradley's head, his posture shifting from impatient to openly hostile. The corporate real estate investor slowly picked up his briefcase from the floor and placed it firmly on his lap. He recognized a collapsing, fraudulent deal when he saw one. Cole did not stop reading. He did not give Bradley a single second to recover from the devastating truth being aired in front of his captive audience. Because of this profound betrayal, the will continued. We cannot in good conscience allow the assets we have worked our entire lives to build to be seized by predatory commercial lenders to satisfy Bradley's fraudulent debts. We refuse to let our family home be liquidated to pay for his reckless arrogance. Therefore, we are establishing a strict conditional bequest regarding the entirety of this estate. I watched my brother's chest heave as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The trap my mother had built was finally closing around his neck. She knew exactly what he would try to do. She knew he would try to sell the house for fast cash the moment they died. She had anticipated every single one of his desperate moves. Cole turned to the third page. This was the moment everything hinged upon. This was the exact clause my mother had designed to protect me and Lily from the absolute ruin Bradley was trying to force upon us. Article 4, Conditional Distribution of the Primary Estate, Cole read, enunciating every single word with perfect clarity. The entirety of the Sutton family estate, including the primary residence, all liquid capital, all investment portfolios, and all personal property, shall only be distributed to a legal heir who can demonstrate absolute financial solvency. Cole paused and looked directly at Bradley. The condition is strict and non-negotiable. In order to inherit any portion of this estate, the heir must present to the executor a certified, fully audited financial statement proving that they carry zero defaulted debt, zero commercial liens, and no encumbrances that could threaten the estate assets. If an heir cannot produce this certified proof of financial health at the time of this reading, they are permanently and irrevocably disqualified from inheriting any portion of the estate. The room remained completely frozen. Bradley was staring at Cole with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The color had drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. Sweat was beginning to bead rapidly on his forehead, catching the bright sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was completely trapped. My parents had essentially built a massive, impenetrable financial firewall around the estate. They made it legally impossible for a bankrupt, fraudulent debtor to touch a single penny. They knew Bradley was drowning in over $800,000 of high-interest loans. They knew he could never pass a certified financial audit. They had legally amputated him from the family wealth to protect the assets from his vicious creditors. And Bradley had arrogantly brought those exact same creditors right into the room to watch it happen. Cole set the thick document down on his leather blotter. He folded his hands together and looked down the long walnut table. As the acting executor of this new will, Cole said, his voice cutting cleanly through the heavy tension, I am now legally required to ask the potential heirs for their documentation. Mr. Sutton, do you have a certified financial statement proving you carry no defaulted debts or commercial encumbrances today? Bradley opened his mouth, but only a dry, choked sound came out. He looked at Jessica, who was staring at him like he was a total stranger. He looked at the debt collector, who was waiting by the door with arms crossed. Bradley was sweating profusely now. The moisture dripped down his temples and stained the collar of his custom silk shirt. He reached a shaking hand up to loosen his expensive silk tie. He had absolutely nothing to give the attorney. He could not produce a fake document because Cole would instantly verify it. He could not lie his way out of a legally mandated audit. He was completely, utterly empty-handed. No? Bradley stammered, his voice sounding weak and pathetic. I do not have that right now. I need more time. This is absurd. You cannot just demand a full audit on the spot. The conditions of the will are explicitly clear, Cole replied smoothly. The documentation must be presented at the time of the reading. If you cannot provide it, you are legally disqualified from the inheritance. Cole then turned his sharp gaze away from my brother. He looked all the way down the long table to where I was sitting quietly in the shadows. He looked at the plain black suit I wore. He looked at my calm, steady posture. Miss Sutton, Cole asked, his tone perfectly polite and professional. Do you have the required documentation? I took a slow, deep breath. I let my fingers brush against the wooden carpenter's pencil in my pocket one last time. Then I reached down and picked up my heavy leather tote bag from the floor. I placed it gently on the polished walnut table. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the wood felt incredibly satisfying. For the past 15 years, I had made myself entirely invisible. I had let my parents treat me like the hired help. I had let Bradley take the prime parking spots, the best food, the loudest voice in the room. I had let Jessica mock my career and my clothes. I had swallowed my pride and accepted the scraps they threw at me because I thought that was what family required. Even just 2 days ago, I had sat on the damp porch of my childhood home and let Jessica offer me a single $100 bill to walk away from my life. I had played the part of the defeated, exhausted sister flawlessly. But that performance was officially over. I opened my leather tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, meticulously bound dossier I had prepared during those long, sleepless hours at the cheap roadside motel. It was completely flawless. I had used every single skill I possessed as a professional medical billing auditor to compile it. It contained certified copies of my personal credit reports, stamped verification from my primary banking institution, and a comprehensive summary of my financial standing. It proved that despite my modest income, I carried absolutely zero defaulted debt. I had no commercial liens. I paid my bills on time. I was completely, undeniably solvent. I did not just stop there. Behind my own personal financial clearance, I had included the second section of the dossier. The section containing the exact routing numbers, the Chicago loan documents, the Delaware Shell Company registrations, and the default notices proving Bradley's massive unpayable debt. I had compiled the exact evidence the probate judge would need to permanently bar him from ever touching the estate. I placed the thick-bound dossier on the polished table. I placed my right hand flat on top of the cover. I looked directly into my brother's terrified, hollow eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a woman who finally understood her own absolute worth. Yes, Mr. Cole, I said clearly, letting every single syllable ring through the quiet conference room. I have the certified financial statements right here. They prove I carry zero defaulting debt and absolutely no encumbrances. I am fully solvent and fully prepared to inherit the estate. I pushed the heavy dossier across the smooth walnut table. It slid perfectly down the center, stopping right in front of Harrison Cole's folded hands. Cole picked up the dossier. He opened the cover and began flipping through the pages. He reviewed the certified banking stamps and the credit clearances. He nodded his head slowly, a look of deep professional respect settling on his sharp features. "These documents appear to be in perfect order," Miss Sutton Cole announced to the room. "The certification is completely valid." The heavy-set debt collector from Chicago let out a low, rough chuckle. It was a sound completely devoid of any humor. It was the sound of a predator realizing its prey was finally cornered without any protection. The debt collector looked at Bradley, uncrossed his arms, and took a heavy step toward the conference room table. "Well, Bradley," the debt collector said, his voice rumbling like gravel, "it looks like you do not have a $1 million estate to hide behind anymore. My boss is going to be incredibly disappointed to hear that the cash wire is not coming today. We are going to have to start liquidating your personal assets immediately. I hope you did not put this fancy suit up as collateral." Jessica let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She pushed her chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. She stared at Bradley, her face twisted in a mask of absolute horror and betrayal. She realized that the lavish lifestyle she had been enjoying was a complete lie. She realized the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the country club memberships were all funded by illegal debt that was now crashing down on their heads. "Bradley," she whispered, her voice trembling with panic. "Bradley, tell me he is lying. Tell me we have the money." Bradley did not look at her. He could not look at her. He was staring at the thick financial dossier sitting in front of Harrison Cole. He was staring at the physical proof of his complete and total destruction. The reality of the situation finally shattered the arrogant delusion he had been living inside for years. He realized that the sister he had mocked and discarded had just systematically dismantled his entire life using nothing but her own intelligence and a stack of paper. Bradley snapped. The polished corporate executive facade completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, terrified child throwing a violent tantrum. He slammed his hands flat onto the walnut table and shot to his feet. His chair tipped backward and crashed heavily onto the carpeted floor. His face was chalk white, his eyes wide and completely wild. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly at me. "This is a forgery!" Bradley screamed, his voice breaking and echoing loudly off the mahogany walls. The sound was shrill and desperate, entirely devoid of his usual manufactured confidence. "It is a fake. She manipulated them. She poisoned their minds when they were sick. She forced them to sign this garbage. You cannot do this to me. I am the successful one. I am the son. The estate belongs to me. This is the final, legally binding last will and testament of Thomas and Diane Sutton." Cole began, his voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. It was drafted, signed, and properly notarized exactly 5 days prior to their passing. As explicitly stated in the opening clauses, this document completely and irrevocably revokes any and all previous wills, codicils, and estate plans, specifically and permanently nullifying the document drafted in October of 2018. Bradley gripped the armrests of his heavy leather chair. His knuckles turned completely white against the dark material. He opened his mouth to speak, but the dry, authoritative tone of the attorney completely steamrolled right over him before he could utter a single word. Cole continued reading the formal legal preamble. The room was absolutely silent. The only sound was the steady hum of the climate control system and the faint rustle of the thick paper as Cole turned to the second page. I shifted my gaze toward the back wall. The aggressive debt collector from Chicago was leaning forward in his chair. His thick arms were crossed over his chest, and his eyes were darting rapidly back and forth between Cole and my brother. Next to him, the sharp corporate real estate investor sat perfectly rigid. The cash transfer contract he had been holding was now resting completely forgotten on his lap. "I direct your attention to Article 3 of this document," Cole said, looking up briefly to ensure every single person in the room was listening. "This section contains a personal statement from Thomas and Diane Sutton, which they mandated must be explicitly read aloud in the presence of their legal heirs." Cole looked back down at the paper. His voice took on a slightly different cadence as he read my parents' final devastating words. "We, Thomas and Diane Sutton, have spent our lives building a legacy of financial stability and familial trust. We trusted our son Bradley to honor that legacy. However, in the final weeks of our lives, we discovered a profound and devastating betrayal. We became aware of severe financial misconduct committed by our son. We intercepted legal notices proving that Bradley forged Thomas Sutton's signature on a massive commercial loan document. We discovered that Bradley is currently hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in defaulted predatory debt. He has continuously lied to us about his professional success choosing instead to live a fraudulent lifestyle funded by illegal loans that he actively attempted to secretly attach to our family estate. The silence that fell over the conference room was absolute and entirely suffocating. It felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. Bradley looked like he had been physically struck by a speeding truck. His mouth hung slightly open. His custom-tailored navy blue suit suddenly seemed entirely too big for his shrinking frame. Jessica was staring at her husband with wide, terrified eyes. She looked like she wanted to crawl under the heavy wooden table and disappear completely. Against the back wall, the Chicago debt collector let out a low, menacing breath. He stared directly at the back of Bradley's head, his posture shifting from impatient to openly hostile. The corporate real estate investor slowly picked up his briefcase from the floor and placed it firmly on his lap. He recognized a collapsing fraudulent deal when he saw one. Cole did not stop reading. He did not give Bradley a single second to recover from the devastating truth being aired in front of his captive audience. Because of this profound betrayal, the will continued. We cannot in good conscience allow the assets we have worked our entire lives to build to be seized by predatory commercial lenders to satisfy Bradley's fraudulent debts. We refuse to let our family home be liquidated to pay for his reckless arrogance. Therefore, we are establishing a strict conditional bequest regarding the entirety of this estate. I watched my brother's chest heave as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The trap my mother had built was finally closing around his neck. She knew exactly what he would try to do. She knew he would try to sell the house for fast cash the moment they died. She had anticipated every single one of his desperate moves. Cole turned to the third page. This was the moment everything hinged upon. This was the exact clause my mother had designed to protect me and Lily from the absolute ruin Bradley was trying to force upon us. Article 4. Conditional distribution of the primary estate, Cole read, enunciating every single word with perfect clarity. The entirety of the Sutton family estate, including the primary residence, all liquid capital, all investment portfolios, and all personal property, shall only be distributed to a legal heir who can demonstrate absolute financial solvency. Cole paused and looked directly at Bradley. The condition is strict and non-negotiable. In order to inherit any portion of this estate, the heir must present to the executor a certified, fully audited financial statement proving that they carry zero defaulted debt, zero commercial liens, and no encumbrances that could threaten the estate assets. If an heir cannot produce this certified proof of financial health at the time of this reading, they are permanently and irrevocably disqualified from inheriting any portion of the estate. The room remained completely frozen. Bradley was staring at Cole with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The color had drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. Sweat was beginning to bead rapidly on his forehead, catching the bright sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was completely trapped. My parents had essentially built a massive, impenetrable financial firewall around the estate. They made it legally impossible for a bankrupt, fraudulent debtor to touch a single penny. They knew Bradley was drowning in over $800,000 of high-interest loans. They knew he could never pass a certified financial audit. They had legally amputated him from the family wealth to protect the assets from his vicious creditors. And Bradley had arrogantly brought those exact same creditors right into the room to watch it happen. Cole set the thick document down on his leather blotter. He folded his hands together and looked down the long walnut table. As the acting executor of this new will, Cole said, his voice cutting cleanly through the heavy tension, I am now legally required to ask the potential heirs for their documentation. Mr. Sutton, do you have a certified financial statement proving you carry no defaulted debts or commercial encumbrances today? Bradley opened his mouth, but only a dry, choked sound came out. He looked at Jessica, who was staring at him like he was a total stranger. He looked at the debt collector, who was waiting by the door with arms crossed. Bradley was sweating profusely now. The moisture dripped down his temples and stained the collar of his custom silk shirt. He reached a shaking hand up to loosen his expensive silk tie. He had absolutely nothing to give the attorney. He could not produce a fake document because Cole would instantly verify it. He could not lie his way out of a legally mandated audit. He was completely, utterly empty-handed. No! Bradley stammered, his voice sounding weak and pathetic. I do not have that right now. I need more time. This is absurd. You cannot just demand a full audit on the spot. The conditions of the will are explicitly clear. Cole replied smoothly. The documentation must be presented at the time of the reading. If you cannot provide it, you are legally disqualified from the inheritance. Cole then turned his sharp gaze away from my brother. He looked all the way down the long table to where I was sitting quietly in the shadows. He looked at the plain black suit I wore. He looked at my calm, steady posture. Miss Sutton, Cole asked, his tone perfectly polite and professional. Do you have the required documentation? I took a slow, deep breath. I let my fingers brush against the wooden carpenter's pencil in my pocket one last time. Then I reached down and picked up my heavy leather tote bag from the floor. I placed it gently on the polished walnut table. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the wood felt incredibly satisfying. For the past 15 years, I had made myself entirely invisible. I had let my parents treat me like the hired help. I had let Bradley take the prime parking spots, the best food, the loudest voice in the room. I had let Jessica mock my career and my clothes. I had swallowed my pride and accepted the scraps they threw at me because I thought that was what family required. Even just 2 days ago, I had sat on the damp porch of my childhood home and let Jessica offer me a single $100 bill to walk away from my life. I had played the part of the defeated, exhausted sister flawlessly, but that performance was officially over. I opened my leather tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, meticulously bound dossier I had prepared during those long, sleepless hours at the cheap roadside motel. It was completely flawless. I had used every single skill I possessed as a professional medical billing auditor to compile it. It contained certified copies of my personal credit reports, stamped verification from my primary banking institution, and a comprehensive summary of my financial standing. It proved that despite my modest income, I carried absolutely zero defaulted debt. I had no commercial liens. I paid my bills on time. I was completely undeniably solvent. I did not just stop there. Behind my own personal financial clearance, I had included the second section of the dossier. The section containing the exact routing numbers, the Chicago loan documents, the Delaware Shell Company registrations, and the default notices proving Bradley's massive unpayable debt. I had compiled the exact evidence the probate judge would need to permanently bar him from ever touching the estate. I placed the thick bound dossier on the polished table. I placed my right hand flat on top of the cover. I looked directly into my brother's terrified, hollow eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a woman who finally understood her own absolute worth. "Yes, Mr. Cole," I said clearly, letting every single syllable ring through the quiet conference room. "I have the certified financial statements right here. They prove I carry zero defaulting debt and absolutely no encumbrances. I am fully solvent and fully prepared to inherit the estate." I pushed the heavy dossier across the smooth walnut table. It slid perfectly down the center, stopping right in front of Harrison Cole's folded hands. Cole picked up the dossier. He opened the cover and began flipping through the pages. He reviewed the certified banking stamps and the credit clearances. He nodded his head slowly, a look of deep professional respect settling on his sharp features. "These documents appear to be in perfect order," Miss Sutton Cole announced to the room. "The certification is completely valid." The heavy-set debt collector from Chicago let out a low, rough chuckle. It was a sound completely devoid of any humor. It was the sound of a predator realizing its prey was finally cornered without any protection. The debt collector looked at Bradley, uncrossed his arms, and took a heavy step toward the conference room table. "Well, Bradley," the debt collector said, his voice rumbling like gravel, "it looks like you do not have $1 million estate to hide behind anymore. My boss is going to be incredibly disappointed to hear that the cash wire is not coming today. We are going to have to start liquidating your personal assets immediately. I hope you did not put this fancy suit up as collateral." Jessica let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She pushed her chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. She stared at Bradley, her face twisted in a mask of absolute horror and betrayal. She realized that the lavish lifestyle she had been enjoying was a complete lie. She realized the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the country club memberships were all funded by illegal debt that was now crashing down on their heads. "Bradley," she whispered, her voice trembling with panic. "Bradley, tell me he is lying. Tell me we have the money." Bradley did not look at her. He could not look at her. He was staring at the thick financial dossier sitting in front of Harrison Cole. He was staring at the physical proof of his complete and total destruction. The reality of the situation finally shattered the arrogant delusion he had been living inside for years. He realized that the sister he had mocked and discarded had just systematically dismantled his entire life using nothing but her own intelligence and a stack of paper. Bradley snapped. The polished corporate executive facade completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, terrified child throwing a violent tantrum. He slammed his hands flat onto the walnut table and shot to his feet. His chair tipped backward and crashed heavily onto the carpeted floor. His face was chalk white, his eyes wide and completely wild. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly at me. "This is a forgery," Bradley screamed, his voice breaking and echoing loudly off the mahogany walls. The sound was shrill and desperate, entirely devoid of his usual manufactured confidence. "It is a fake. She manipulated them. She poisoned their minds when they were sick. She forced them to sign this garbage. You cannot do this to me. I am the successful one. I am the son. The estate belongs to me. Bradley's scream echoed off the thick mahogany panels of the conference room. It was not the sound of a powerful corporate executive. It was the shrill, broken cry of a cornered animal. For my entire life, I had watched this man dominate every room he walked into. He had controlled our parents. He had controlled the narrative of our family. He had relentlessly shoved me into the darkest corners of my own existence. But standing there now, his face a chalky, sickly white, his expensive custom suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume, he was nothing. The illusion was completely shattered. The golden sun was dead, and the desperate fraud was finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. He lunged forward. His hands clawed desperately toward the polished walnut table, reaching for the thick financial dossier I had compiled. He thought he could just rip the pages apart. He thought he could destroy the evidence with brute force exactly the way he had destroyed everything else in our family. But he never even made it to the edge of the wood. The heavy-set debt collector from Chicago moved with a terrifying, violent speed. He stepped directly into Bradley's path, slamming his thick hand squarely against my brother's chest. The impact stopped Bradley cold, knocking the breath out of his lungs. A second later, the sharp corporate real estate investor stepped up right beside the debt collector. The investor dropped his leather briefcase to the carpeted floor with a heavy thud. He crossed his arms, forming a solid, impenetrable human wall between my brother and the table. "Sit down, Bradley." The debt collector growled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, barely contained fury. "You are not touching a single piece of paper on that table. You are not shredding the proof of your crimes. You dragged us all the way down here to watch you inherit millions. We watched you humiliate your own sister. We watched you parade around like a king. Now you're going to sit in that chair and you are going to listen to exactly how bankrupt you really are." Bradley stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his heavy leather chair. He collapsed into the seat, his chest heaving rapidly. He looked up at Attorney Harrison Cole, his eyes wide and completely stripped of their usual arrogant shine. He opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, trying to spin another lie. But Cole simply adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at my brother with absolute clinical disgust. "You do not seem to fully grasp the gravity of your situation, Mr. Sutton." Cole said, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "You are not simply disinherited. Your parents did not just write you out of this document to protect their assets. They recognized the severe legal and financial threat you posed to their legacy. They understood that you had committed massive financial fraud by forging your father's signature on a $450,000 commercial loan." Cole picked up a new separate legal document from his pristine desk blotter. It was bordered in severe red ink. He held it up for the entire room to see. Therefore, Cole continued, never breaking eye contact with my trembling brother. "As the executor of this estate, I have been strictly mandated by Thomas and Diane Sutton to immediately initiate a comprehensive civil lawsuit against you. The estate is formally suing you, Bradley Sutton, for the entire $450,000 you fraudulently extracted, plus all associated legal fees, accrued interest, and punitive damages for elder financial abuse." The words hung in the quiet air, completely suffocating my brother. He was not just walking away with nothing. He was walking away owing the estate hundreds of thousands of dollars. The very entity he had tried to rob was now turning around to destroy him completely. If he thought his Chicago creditors were merciless, he was about to face the full, unyielding wrath of Harrison Cole and the Pennsylvania probate court system. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, holding my small wooden carpenter's pencil. I did not smile. I did not laugh. I felt a profound, overwhelming wave of pure relief wash over my soul. For years, I had carried the heavy, crushing guilt that somehow I was not a good enough daughter. I had believed my parents favored Bradley because I was fundamentally flawed. But sitting in this room, watching the legal execution of my brother's lies, I finally understood the truth. My parents had been blinded by his manipulation, but in their final days, they had seen clearly. They had spent their last ounce of strength building a fortress to protect me and my daughter Lily. They had trusted me to finish the job. I turned my gaze away from Bradley and looked across the table at his wife. Jessica was sitting completely frozen in her chair. The heavy diamond earrings dangling from her ears suddenly looked incredibly heavy, pulling her down into the terrible reality of her new life. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking violently in her lap. Her eyes were fixed completely on her husband, and the expression on her face was a mixture of absolute horror and profound, sickening realization. She had married the golden boy. She had married the successful corporate director who promised her country club memberships, luxury vacations in exotic resorts, and a massive inheritance that would secure her status forever. She had stood on the wet porch of my parents' house just 2 days ago, arrogantly offering me a single $100 bill like I was a beggar on the street. She had mocked my clothes, mocked my career, and mocked my grief. Now she was staring at a man who was utterly, hopelessly bankrupt. She realized that every single luxury they enjoyed was funded by illegal, predatory debt. She realized that the massive lawsuit Cole had just announced would completely drain whatever meager funds they had left. The luxury cars would be repossessed. The heavily mortgaged house would be foreclosed upon. Her perfect, flawless life was completely over. Bradley turned his head slowly, looking at his wife with a desperate, pleading expression. "Jessica," he whispered, his voice cracking horribly. "Jessica, please, we can fix this. I can call my investors. I can make a deal. Just give me a chance to explain." Jessica did not say a single word. She did not yell at him. She did not cry. She simply reached out with a trembling hand, picked up her expensive designer handbag from the center of the walnut table, and stood up from her chair. The scraping sound of the wooden legs against the carpet was the only noise in the room. Jessica, Bradley begged, reaching out a sweaty hand toward her wrist. "Do not leave me here. Do not walk out. We are a team. We can fight this together." She pulled her arm away from him like he was infected with a deadly disease. She looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was the exact same look she had given me on the porch, but now it was directed entirely at her husband. She turned on her expensive heels and walked straight toward the heavy mahogany doors. She did not look back. She pushed the doors open and walked out of the conference room, the sharp clicking of her shoes fading rapidly down the long corporate hallway. She was gone. She was going to file for divorce before the sun went down. Bradley sat completely alone at the head of the table. The silence in the room was absolute. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the adulation of others. He needed an audience to survive. He needed people to worship him, fear him, or depend on him. Without his fake money, his fake status, and his compliant wife, he was absolutely nothing. He was an empty shell sitting in a ruined custom suit. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table. The sound drew the attention of every single man in the room. Attorney Harrison Cole looked at me, a quiet, respectful nod, acknowledging that my part in this performance was finally over. The corporate real estate investor and the angry debt collector stepped aside, giving me a wide, clear path. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my simple black suit. For 34 years, I had walked with my head bowed, my shoulders hunched, trying to take up as little space as possible in my own family. I had allowed Bradley to dictate my worth. I had believed his cruel narrative that I was just the quiet, useless sister who was destined to serve others. I did not feel quiet anymore. I did not feel small. I felt incredibly tall. I felt powerful. I felt the immense, unbreakable strength of a mother who had just secured her daughter's future against a monster. I walked slowly down the length of the polished walnut table. Every step was deliberate. Every step felt like shedding a massive, suffocating weight. I walked right up to the chair where my brother was sitting. Bradley slowly lifted his head. His face was stained with sweat and tears. His eyes were bloodshot and completely wild with panic. He looked up at me, waiting for me to scream at him. He was waiting for me to gloat, to curse his name, to throw his years of abuse right back in his face. He expected me to act like him, but I was absolutely nothing like him. I did not need to scream to be heard. I did not need to be cruel to be strong. I looked down at the broken, miserable man sitting in the leather chair. I thought about the times he had laughed at my struggles. I thought about the text message he had sent me just a few hours ago telling me to enjoy living on the streets. I thought about the sheer breathtaking audacity of a brother who would cheerfully render his own niece homeless just to save his corporate reputation. "You told me I owned nothing." "Bradley," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, perfectly steady, and absolutely cold. The words resonated in the quiet room, echoing off the expensive wood and glass. Bradley stared at me, his lip trembling, completely unable to form a coherent response. "You were right," I continued, holding his gaze until he was forced to look away in total shame. "I own nothing of yours. I own absolutely everything that is mine." I turned my back on him. I did not wait for a response. I did not care if he ever spoke another word to me for the rest of his miserable life. He was no longer my brother. He was just a bankrupt stranger sitting in a room full of people who were about to tear him apart. As I took my first step toward the heavy mahogany doors, I heard the sound begin. It started as a low, ragged gasp and then broke into a loud, wet, pathetic sob. Bradley Sutton, the golden child. The corporate king completely collapsed into himself. He buried his face in his sweating hands and began sobbing uncontrollably right there at the conference table. Behind me, the heavy-set debt collector from Chicago took a slow, heavy step forward. His heavy shoes crunched into the carpet. "All right, Bradley," the debt collector said, his voice rumbling with a dark, terrible finality. The family drama is officially over. Your wife is gone. Your inheritance is gone. Now it is just you and me. Let us talk about exactly how you are going to pay back the hundreds of thousands of dollars you owe my firm. I highly suggest we start by walking out to the parking lot and handing me the keys to whatever expensive car you drove here today. The real estate investor snapped his briefcase shut, the loud click echoing over Bradley's pathetic crying. The investor muttered a sharp curse about wasted time and walked briskly out of the room, leaving Bradley entirely alone with his worst nightmare. I walked out of the conference room and stepped into the quiet, brightly lit hallway. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or regret. I pressed the button for the elevator and watched the metal doors slide open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, bringing me closer to the busy Philadelphia streets, I reached into my pocket and touched the small wooden carpenter's pencil one last time. My father was gone. My mother was gone. The family I thought I knew had completely destroyed itself. But I was still standing. I had survived the storm. I had fought the monster and completely won. I walked out of the glass skyscraper and into the afternoon sunlight. The gray clouds had finally broken, leaving the sky a brilliant, blinding blue. I took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air. It was a little past 3:30 in the afternoon. I was not going back to the cheap roadside motel. I was going to pick Lily up from school just like I promised. We were going to get the biggest ice cream sundaes we could possibly carry. And then we were going to go home. Our home. Everything was finally going to be perfectly fine. I pulled my car keys from my pocket, unlocked my 10-year-old sedan, and drove away from the financial district without ever looking back. For the very first time in my 34 years of life, the road ahead belonged entirely to me. The heavy brass key slid into the brand new deadbolt with a satisfying solid click. I turned it slowly, feeling the smooth mechanical resistance before the lock finally gave way. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped into the wide, sunlit foyer of my childhood home. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh lavender. It was a complete contrast to the stale cigarette smoke and bleach of that miserable roadside motel where my brother had tried to banish me. I stood in the entryway and just breathed. The house was completely silent, but it was not the heavy, suffocating silence of fear or grief. It was the beautiful, resonant silence of absolute peace. I had hired a locksmith the very morning the probate judge officially recognized my mother's final will. I had every single lock on every single door and window completely replaced. I wanted to make absolutely certain that the toxic, arrogant energy Bradley had brought into the sanctuary was permanently locked out forever. Lily ran past my legs, her sneakers squeaking lightly against the polished hardwood floors. She was holding her favorite stuffed bear, the same bear that had hidden the brass key and ultimately saved our lives. She ran straight into the living room and spun around in a wide circle, laughing as the bright afternoon sunlight caught her hair. I watched her pure, unadulterated joy and felt a profound warmth spread through my entire chest. We had spent weeks moving our things back in, carefully restoring the house to exactly how my parents had loved it. The antique cherrywood sewing table was back in its rightful corner. The heavy brass floor lamp stood proudly in my father's study. I had tracked down the estate sale buyers using the meticulous ledgers Jessica had left behind in her frantic panic to escape the property. I used the estate funds to buy back every single piece of family history that Bradley had tried to illegally liquidate. I brought our home back to life. The justice that fell upon my brother was swift, brutal, and entirely of his own making. Harrison Cole was a man of his word. The moment the probate judge ruled in our favor, Cole unleashed the full, devastating power of the legal system against Bradley. The Chicago debt collectors realized they were never going to get their fraudulent cash wire from the estate. They immediately turned their aggressive sights directly onto Bradley's personal assets. They filed massive civil suits. They seized his leased luxury vehicles right out of his driveway in the middle of the night. They placed heavy liens on his massive suburban mansion, forcing it into immediate foreclosure. But the civil suits were only the beginning of his nightmare. The federal authorities had been notified of the $450,000 commercial loan he had secured using our dying father's forged signature. That was not just poor financial management. That was a severe federal crime. Bradley was currently facing multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder financial abuse. His highly paid corporate defense attorneys abandoned him the moment his bank accounts ran completely dry. He was forced to use a heavily overworked public defender. His trial was set for early next year, and the prosecuting attorneys were pushing for significant prison time. But perhaps the most poetic justice of all was his current daily reality. The probate judge had ordered Bradley to pay complete restitution to the estate for the items he had managed to sell, before I stopped the unauthorized estate sale. Because his corporate career was completely destroyed, and his reputation in the financial sector was radioactive, no legitimate firm would ever hire him. The golden child. The man who wore custom silk suits and mocked my medical billing career was now working the early morning shift at a local big-box hardware store. He spent his days wearing a bright orange vest, loading bags of heavy concrete and cheap fertilizer into the trunks of customers' cars for minimum wage. Every single paycheck he earned was aggressively garnished by the court. Jessica did not stick around to watch the empire fall. The moment she walked out of Harrison Cole's conference room, she drove straight to a divorce attorney. She filed for an emergency dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences and extreme financial infidelity. She packed her designer clothes, her heavy diamond jewelry, and her expensive handbags, and moved back into her parents' wealthy estate in Connecticut. She completely abandoned Bradley to face the burning wreckage of his life completely alone. I felt absolutely no pity for her. She had willingly participated in his cruelty. She had stood on my front porch and offered me a $100 bill to surrender my entire future. She learned the hard way that marrying for fake status eventually leaves you with absolutely nothing of real value. While Bradley's life completely unraveled, I focused entirely on building mine. The inheritance my parents left me was substantial, but I refused to simply live off the principle and do nothing. I knew the value of hard work. I knew the satisfaction of earning my own way. I took a carefully calculated portion of the estate funds and officially launched my own independent medical billing and financial auditing firm. I leased a beautiful, bright office space in the downtown business district just a few blocks away from Harrison Cole's building. I hired 2 incredibly smart, hardworking single mothers to help me manage the rapidly growing client list. My reputation for meticulous forensic accounting. The exact same skills I used to dismantle Bradley's massive fraud quickly spread through the local medical community. Independent clinics and small private practices hired my firm to audit their denied insurance claims and streamline their revenue cycles. For the first time in my 34 years of life, I was completely in charge. I was the boss. I sat behind a large, solid oak desk and negotiated contracts with aggressive insurance representatives using the exact same calm, icy confidence I had found in the vault of First National Bank. I no longer folded myself into smaller shapes to make other people comfortable. I took up exactly the amount of space I deserved. The security I felt was entirely life-changing. I set up an ironclad trust fund for Lily, ensuring her college education and her future would never be threatened by anyone. We no longer worried about affording groceries or paying the utility bills on time. Our refrigerator was always fully stocked. The heating system worked perfectly, filling the house with a deep, comforting warmth on chilly nights. Every morning I drove Lily to her elementary school, and every afternoon I picked her up right on time. We went out for ice cream whenever we wanted. We lived a beautiful, quiet, normal life, completely free from the toxic, heavy shadow of my brother's constant manipulation and greed. Later that evening after dinner, Lily and I walked out onto the wide front porch. The weather was absolutely perfect. The brutal, freezing rain that had marked the darkest week of my life was completely gone, a distant memory washed away by the changing seasons. The late spring air was warm and smelled faintly of blooming honeysuckle from the garden. We sat together on the wooden porch swing, rocking gently back and forth. The chains creaked a soft, rhythmic sound that felt like a heartbeat. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the evening sky in brilliant, sweeping strokes of bright orange, deep purple, and soft pink. I wrapped my arm around Lily's small shoulders, pulling her close against my side. She rested her head against my chest, holding her mended stuffed bear tightly in her lap. I looked out at the quiet, peaceful suburban street. I thought about the painful, agonizing journey that had brought us back to this exact spot. I thought about the decades I had spent believing that family was strictly defined by shared blood and a shared last name. I had spent my entire childhood and my early adult years desperately seeking the approval of a brother, who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient servant and a minor obstacle. I had accepted their cruelty because I believed that simply being related meant you had to endure the pain. But sitting here on this porch, feeling the solid reality of the house surrounding me, I finally understood the profound truth. Family is absolutely not just about blood. Blood is simply a biological accident. True family is about who stands by your side when the absolute worst storms of life tear your roof off. Family is about the people who protect you when you are too tired to protect yourself. It is about honesty, respect, and an unbreakable foundation of genuine care. My brother shared my blood, but he was never truly my family. He was a predator who wore the mask of a sibling. The real family was the invisible, unbreakable bond of love my mother had shown me from beyond the grave. She had seen the truth. She had recognized my brother's dark nature, and she had spent her final days meticulously crafting a heavy iron shield to place over my life. She had left me the tools, the truth, and the opportunity to finally stand up and fight for my own survival. She had forced me to find my own voice. Her love was the key that unlocked the vault of my own strength. I looked down at Lily, watching her eyes slowly close as the gentle rocking of the porch swing lulled her to sleep. I pressed a kiss to her forehead. I promised myself right then and there that I would raise her to be incredibly strong. I would teach her how to read the fine print, how to recognize manipulation, and how to walk away from toxic people without a single ounce of hesitation. I would teach her that her voice mattered and that she never ever had to make herself small to keep someone else warm. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft, glowing twilight in its wake. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm yellow glow across the freshly cut lawn. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel bitter about the past. I only felt a deep, overwhelming gratitude for the present moment and a fierce, blazing hope for the future. The estate was secure. The fraudulent debts were completely erased from our name. The monster was banished to a life of hard labor and public humiliation. We were finally safe. We were finally home, and absolutely no one was ever going to take it away from us again. If you have ever been the quiet one in your family, if you have ever been underestimated, mocked, or treated like a burden by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to hear this loud and clear. Your silence is not weakness. It is often simply the careful gathering of strength. You do not owe your loyalty to toxic people just because you share the same bloodline. You have the absolute right to set firm, unbreakable boundaries to protect your peace and to demand the respect you genuinely deserve. Never let an arrogant bully convince you that you own nothing. You own your intelligence, you own your resilience, and you own the power to write the final chapter of your own story. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. If my story resonated with your own life experiences, if you believe in the power of justice and the importance of standing up for yourself, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. I would absolutely love to hear from you. Please drop a comment below letting me know exactly what city or state you are watching from right now and what time it is there. Your support means the absolute world to me. Until next time, remember to protect your peace and always read the fine print. Take care. It has been several months since that dramatic afternoon in Harrison Cole's mahogany-paneled office. And as I sit here on the wide front porch of my fully restored childhood home watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and purple, I realize that the most important part of my entire story is not the money. It is not the hidden safe deposit box, the brass key, or the sudden multi-million-dollar inheritance. It is certainly not the look of absolute unadulterated terror on my brother Bradley's face when his entire fraudulent corporate empire collapsed around him in front of his aggressive creditors. Those things provided justice, yes. They provided a necessary, long overdue balancing of the scales. But the true, lasting resolution of this incredibly painful journey goes much deeper than financial restitution or dramatic courtroom victories. It is about understanding the psychological reality of toxic family dynamics and recognizing the invisible, heavy chains that hold us down for decades. For 34 years, I genuinely believed that I was fundamentally flawed. I believed that my parents heavily favored Bradley because he was inherently better, smarter, and far more deserving of their unconditional love and their resources. I quietly accepted my assigned role as the family servant, the compliant caretaker, the one who could be repeatedly pushed aside, ignored, mocked, and discarded whenever my presence became inconvenient to their perfect narrative. I thought my mistreatment was a direct reflection of my own inadequate worth. I thought if I just worked harder, if I just loved them more completely, if I sacrificed my own career and my own comfort to change their hospice bedding and manage their medications, they would finally wake up and see my value. But I was completely fundamentally wrong. And if you are listening to my voice right now and you have lived through a similar nightmare for decades, I need you to understand that you are completely wrong about yourself too. It is never your fault when the people who are supposed to protect you decide to use you instead. In almost every single toxic family system, there is a golden child and a scapegoat. The golden child, like my older brother Bradley, is the human mirror that the parents use to reflect their own idealized perfect image back to the world. The golden child is given all the praise, all the financial resources, all the emotional support, and absolutely none of the accountability. He is allowed to be selfish, deeply arrogant, and incredibly cruel, because holding him accountable for his terrible actions would mean the parents have to look in the mirror and admit their own massive failures. They build an illusion of success around him even if that success is entirely funded by predatory loans, deceit, and manipulation. But a family system built on lies, manipulation, and conditional love desperately needs a place to dump all of its hidden, rotting dysfunction. It needs a human receptacle for the blame, the deep shame, and the unresolved guilt. That is exactly where the scapegoat comes in. For my entire life, I was that receptacle. I was the scapegoat. Society often assumes that the scapegoat is the weakest, most defective member of the family. People look at these dynamics and assume the scapegoat is targeted because they are vulnerable, slow, unintelligent, or simply incapable of defending themselves against the stronger personalities in the room. But the psychological reality is the exact opposite. The scapegoat is almost always the strongest, most perceptive, and most empathetic person in the entire family. You are not targeted because you are weak or broken. You are targeted because you see the genuine truth. You are targeted because your very existence, your quiet competence, and your moral compass refuse to fully participate in the shared family delusion. I was the one who saw Bradley's breathtaking arrogance for exactly what it was. I was the one who quietly handled the difficult, unglamorous, exhausting reality of our parents' declining physical health, while he paraded around downtown playing the role of the highly successful executive. My existence made them uncomfortable because I was real and they were entirely fake. They had to systematically tear me down, diminish my personal achievements, isolate my daughter Lily, and treat me like dirt because if they ever stopped to acknowledge my true value, their entire house of cards would completely collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy. When my parents finally saw the objective truth in their final days, when they discovered Bradley's massive financial fraud and the devastating, unforgivable betrayal he had committed against them, by forging our father's signature, the shock was profound. They realized that the golden son they had worshipped was actually a financial monster, and the daughter they had repeatedly discarded was the only person who actually cared about their well-being. They tried to fix it at the very last minute. They changed the will, they locked the truth inside that metal box, and my mother sewed the brass key into my daughter's muddy stuffed bear. I am deeply grateful for the protection they finally offered me, but the hard truth is that it should never have taken a fatal car accident and a $500,000 fraudulent commercial loan for them to finally recognize my worth. I spent decades agonizing over their approval. I bent over backwards, sacrificing my personal life, my financial stability, and my emotional well-being just to earn a tiny, pathetic crumb of affection from people who were entirely committed to misunderstanding me. I know that many of you watching this have done the exact same thing. Maybe you are in your 50s or 60s right now, and you have spent your entire adult life trying to please a mother who only criticizes you, or a father who only values your sibling. You keep showing up to the holiday dinners you keep buying, the thoughtful gifts you keep biting your tongue when they insult your choices, hoping that this time things will magically be different. That is the absolute greatest lie we tell ourselves when we are trapped in abusive, manipulative family dynamics. We tell ourselves that loyalty is an absolute, unbreakable obligation. We are heavily conditioned by society, by television, and by cultural expectations to believe that blood is thicker than water, that family is everything, and that walking away from the people who raised you is the ultimate unforgivable sin. We are taught to endure the unendurable simply because we share a last name. I am here to tell you with every single ounce of conviction in my soul that walking away from abusive family members is absolutely not an act of betrayal. It is an act of profound, necessary self-respect. You are not required to set yourself on fire just to keep your toxic relatives warm. You do not owe your life, your precious mental health, or your hard-earned financial security to people who actively plot your emotional destruction. Sharing DNA does not give anyone a free, lifelong pass to treat you like garbage. When you finally decide to stand up, draw a firm, unbreakable boundary, and walk out the door, you are not destroying the family. The family was already destroyed by their abuse. You are simply refusing to be the designated victim of their dysfunction any longer. You are actively stopping the cycle of generational trauma so it does not infect your own children. I know that I was incredibly lucky in how my story physically ended. My mother left me a literal brass key to my financial salvation. She left me a hidden, perfectly drafted legal document and the resources to completely dismantle my brother's vicious attacks in a boardroom. I know exactly how rare that specific outcome is. I know that most people who finally find the courage to escape toxic families do not find a secret safe deposit box waiting for them at First National Bank. Most people have to walk away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their back, an empty bank account, and the terrifying heavy burden of starting completely over from scratch. But I need you to hear this. You do not need a multi-million-dollar inheritance to reclaim your personal worth. You do not need a high-powered, intimidating attorney in a fancy mahogany conference room to prove to the world that you are valuable. The most powerful weapon I had in that room was not the new will, and it was not the certified financial dossier I compiled at the motel. The most powerful, devastating weapon I possessed was the deep, unshakable realization that I no longer needed my brother's approval. And I absolutely no longer accepted his pathetic definition of who I was. When I looked at Bradley as he was crying and screaming in his ruined custom suit, and I told him that I owned nothing of his, but I owned everything that was mine. I was not talking about the real estate property or the offshore bank accounts. I was talking about my soul. I was talking about my brilliant mind, my capability as a mother, and my completely unwritten future. He could not touch those things. He could not manipulate them with a forged power of attorney, and he could never, ever take them away from me again. You have that exact same immense power sitting quietly inside of you right now. Whether you are 25 years old or 65 years old, it is never too late to stop playing the horrible role they assigned to you at birth. It is never too late to look at the people who have diminished you, stepped on you, used you for free labor, and mocked your dreams, and firmly say enough. It is terrifying. It is the hardest, most painful thing you will ever do. There will be days when the heavy guilt tries to creep back into your mind, when the loud voices of your extended relatives tell you that you are making a massive mistake and tearing the family apart. But the profound, beautiful, quiet peace that waits for you on the other side of that boundary is worth every single tear you will shed to get there. You are not a burden. You are not a disappointment. You are not the difficult, dramatic one simply because you finally demand to be treated with basic, fundamental human dignity. You are a survivor. And surviving the people who were supposed to love and protect you is a quiet, heroic victory that you should celebrate every single day of your life. Do not wait for them to hand you a key. Build your own door and walk right through it. If you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you, if you have ever been treated like the hired help in your own home, or if you have ever had to build your entire life from the absolute ground up because your family completely abandoned you when you needed them the most. I see you. I completely understand the quiet, heavy pain you carry in your chest every single day. And I want you to know right now that you are absolutely not alone. There is a massive unspoken community of us out there, thousands of people who have had to become our own heroes because the ones we trusted utterly failed us. Your unique story matters. Your difficult healing process matters. And the firm boundaries you set to protect your peace and your children are entirely valid and necessary. If my journey resonated with your heart today, if you felt a spark of recognition in the painful struggles I faced, or if you simply found comfort and satisfaction in the justice that was finally served in that conference room, please take a moment to hit that like button. Please subscribe to the channel right now. Doing so does not just support me and this platform, it actively helps the algorithm push these vital stories out to other people who might be sitting in the dark right now, crying, wondering if they are crazy for wanting to escape their toxic families. It helps them find the courage to stand up, pack their bags, and reclaim their own beautiful lives. I also want to connect with you directly in the comments section today. We are building a strong, supportive community here, a genuinely safe space where we can share our most difficult truths without any judgment or shame. Drop a comment right now and tell me what state or city are you watching from and what time is it there. I absolutely love seeing how far these stories reach across the country and the world. And please let me know your deepest thoughts on setting boundaries with toxic family members. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who shared your blood because the abuse became too much to bear? How did you ultimately find the incredible strength to do it? And how has your life positively changed since you made that incredibly difficult life-altering choice? Share your personal experience below because your exact words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to find their own hidden strength. Your survival story could be the blueprint that saves someone else. You do not have to carry the crushing weight of other people's dysfunction anymore. You are allowed to put the heavy bags down. You are allowed to lock the doors. You are allowed to choose yourself, your peace, and your future. Until next time, please take care of yourself. Be incredibly kind to the strong, resilient person looking back at you in the mirror, and always remember that your future is entirely yours to write.